Hello and welcome to the Russian causes of the First World War, a tradition of aggression versus the Tsar saint, alternatively Tsarism and Pan-Slavism. I am very lucky to be joined again on this channel by Rupert August. Hello, how are you doing?
Doing well. Thank you very much for having me. Wonderful to be back.
So I thought about starting this conversation by talking about what I can really consider to be a futility of meaning, or the futility of trying to search out some narrative, specifically of justice, in the First World War. The whole backdrop of World War One tends to lead to elegiac or nostalgic perspectives on the great European peace, the European peace between 1871 and 1914. And when we're looking for justice in World War One, especially in terms of tropes of national memory or whatever, they tend to be retroactive justifications for World War One. By that I mean they only find their resolution in the Second World War, whether it be the Great British Bulldog overcoming Hunnic, i.e. German Nazi supremacy, the Soviets' Great Patriotic War, or America, the arsenal of democracy, making the world safe for democracy, the failed League of Nations arriving at the, of course, completely successful United Nations. In terms of looking for meaning, I mean, if you just look at the perspectives of the Entente powers, of which Russia, the main subject for this conversation is going to be the major focus, was a member. What was Russia's purpose in this war, if we're not going to sort of lean on tropes about expansionism? Was it a war for Christian civilization? There was very much an interpretation in the air, and indeed part of you could say, a war mythology, that this was a great 1812-like revisitation. Napoleon is invading, and once more Russia is going to be able to withstand the invader. There were even references from Tsar Nicholas II to Alexander, his namesake, during the Great Napoleonic Invasion, whereby he declared, I solemnly swear never to make peace while there is a single enemy on Russian soil. But of course, Tsarism collapsed, so what war for the defense of Christian civilization was there? Then there is another element which we're going to be unpacking throughout this evening, which is the Great Pan-Slavic War, the war of the Slavs against the German menace. If you look at the arguments of figures like Alexei Brusilov, one of the great Russian generals in particular, that was very much his perception of what the war had come to assume by 1917, and one of his more esoteric reasons as to why he decided to fall his lot in with the Bolsheviks. Nevertheless, if we're going to look at this as a great pan-Slavic war against the Germans, then we have to consider that this entire narrative is destroyed with the Russian Revolution, and especially the Polish-Soviet War from 1919 onwards, where you have the great Slavic nations such as Serbia, now Yugoslavia, and Poland, basically being outright hostile in their approach to Russia. And of course, Bulgaria, one of these other great Slavic powers, was already hostile to Russia at this point. If we're looking at expansionism as a goal for Russia during the First World War, Trotsky and the Soviets would go out of their way to discredit and demonize the legacy of Russian imperialism and Russia's reason to exist in the First World War as part of their whole mantra of bringing peace back to Russia, albeit we all know that didn't turn out quite correctly. If you take this whole notion of there being a pan-Slavic quality or justification for World War One, the interesting thing is that the non-Soviet Slavs, the Poles, the what later become the Czechoslovaks, the Yugoslavs, were taken in under the umbrella of Russia's old ally, France. This had been a process that had even begun before the First World War during the Franco-Russian alliance, which we're going to talk about. But this infrastructure for a Frankish Slavonic alliance, basically cordoning in Germany throughout the 1930s, had basically collapsed before even National Socialism and Hitler came to power in 1933. If you're looking at Britain and its role in terms of propping up this great peace settlement after the First World War, they essentially abandon and repudiate the legacy of Versailles by 1935. Even Italy's victory, which was part of the Entente and fought against Austria and Britain on the side of the Russians during the First World War, even Italy, who I've argued elsewhere in this channel, arguably had the greatest of all victories in the war by dismantling Austria-Hungary, their great perennial enemy and the enemy of Italian unification in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, referred to the Italian victory as the quote-unquote mutilated victory. So in the absence of justice in the First World War, the debate And indeed, the academic debate tends to devolve into accusations over guilt over a conflict that wasn't ultimately resolved to some of the sides' satisfaction until 1945. We look at the events that lead up to the First World War, the assassination of Franz Josef, Serb culpability in the beginning of World War I through the Princip Black Hand connection to the assassins. And then we look at things like the Austrian ultimatum, the ultimatum that was designed to be rejected by the Serbs, acting as some sort of catalyst for a Russian intervention. And then we look at Germany's role by giving unconditional, quote unquote, support to the Austrians through the blank check. Indeed, all of these elements revolve around another frustrating and I would say almost mind sort of numbingly stupid aspect of the World War I discourse, which is anti-German accusations that because Germany had been responsible for the Second World War, thereby retroactively, we can also assume that Germany definitely was responsible for the First World War, and it wasn't just a post hoc justification to demand a vast war indemnity for the Germans through a war guilt clause in the Treaty of Versailles. You see this through the Fischer thesis, Germany and its plan under Bethmann Holdych to create Middle Europa and conquer Europe in the 1960s. Indeed, what I find very frustrating about all of these analyses revolving around justification or war guilt or whatever to any of these powers is they all seem to be politically conditioned. So obviously it suited the interests of the great powers in 1919 to have Germany being the main power culpable for the First World War, so they could justify effectively extracting vast reparations and imposing a draconian peace on Germany. Conversely, by the time you get to the 1960s, there is perhaps an atmosphere that Germany can build a conservative identity for itself, which is virulently anti-Soviet in West Germany. And so in order for this new Germany to avoid having some sort of conservative character, Fischer comes along and redoubles Germany's historic commitment, indeed unique commitment, to being an aggressive warmongering stain upon world history. And really, it's only by the time we get to the 1970s, the 1980s, and even you can say the collapse of the Cold War configuration in Europe, the end of the Eastern Bloc, that we begin to have some serious revision about Russia's role. Indeed, I've talked about the assassination attempt at Sarajevo. I've talked about the Austrian ultimatum. I've talked about the blank check, all of these great events which form our understanding of leading up to the First World War. And yet, I, in terms of my own study and analysis of this period, very early on came to my own conclusions about this, is that none of these events were the most significant. By far, the most significant event in the quote-unquote July crisis preceding the First World War was the secret mobilization of the Russian army between the 24th and the 25th of July, 1914, and that it was none other than the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Sazonov, who indirectly or directly had the most culpability for setting off the chain of events in motion that led to Germany's activation of the Schlieffen Plan. A few days later, this isn't an original view. It was a view first really expounded upon by one German historian, Thomas Nippedy, in the 1970s. So what's fascinating about this is that as the German dominant narrative of the Fischer era from the 1960s begins to recede, and as historians basically assume a degree of sanity again in dealing with the causes of the First World War, not only does that mean we're dealing with a far more objective analysis that takes in consideration all of the interests and culpabilities of all of the powers without having to focus obsessively on the idea of guilt and of blame and national memory or castigation or whatever. But it also revives old tropes about these countries, whether it be Britain, France, or in particular, Russia. In particular, when we have the situation with Putin, the situation with Ukraine, really going back even before Ukraine to the invasion of Georgia in 2008, 2009, we have this revival of these generalized Russian tropes that have been more or less dormant for a long period of time when dealing with the causes of the First World War. And that is really what we're going to be talking about today, not just the immediate Russian causes for the First World War, but you can say the meta in terms of all of these sort of reasonings for these various revisions as to what culpabilities or you can say generalized traits these powers are supposed to be exhibit. And this comes into a form of expression of a tradition of quote unquote Russian aggression, whether that's valid or whether that term is only really coming into vogue now, and especially in regards to World War One, as to find some sort of retroactive foreign policy DNA for understanding Russia's foreign policy today. Conversely, and looking at this again from someone who has probably obsessed too much over the nature of Russian Tsarism, we come to the idea of the passion bearer, Nicholas II. Nicholas II, as I'm sure everyone is aware, was assassinated by the Bolsheviks along with his immediate family, his 4 daughters, his son, and his wife in the House of Special Purpose in Ekaterinburg in July of 1918. In the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, we have the cause of canonization which succeeds. And Tsar Nicholas is canonized not as a martyr of the faith, but a man who died in his faith. In other words, the church is confirming, the Russian Orthodox is confirming that Nicholas II died as a witness to Christ, and therefore he's assumed a place in heaven. But if we try and understand that so many of these narratives dealing with World War One are fixated on this idea of guilt and this idea of justice, how can you simultaneously have a Tsar passion bearer, a Tsar who is a witness to Christ, who of course is the Prince of Peace, also being a Tsar warmonger? It makes no sense. And that really is sort of the main sort of element I want to unpack here, the relationship between Tsarism and, you can say, the more expansionist and aggressive aims of Russian foreign policy. Indeed, it's not just something I've thought about regarding Nicholas II, it's something I've also thought about, Rupert, with King Charles I of England, in particular, reading his Icon Basilica, the image of a king, and his justifications and his lack, you can say, of reasoning that he was responsible for the English Civil War or the War of the Three Kingdoms. And indeed, this fixation on Nicholas, again, being a sainted ruler or a Tsar who is going to revitalize Christianity, not just in terms of Russia and the world, is not something post hoc that was invented by the Russian Orthodox Church in the 1990s. It was something that the Tsar actively tried to cultivate. It's something that I focused a great deal of time on when focusing on Rasputin and the whole Russian mentality as to why a figure like Rasputin could exist and how he rose to the heart of power in Russia. And it was this idea that, coinciding with the great Tsar conqueror, the Tsar as the source of national indissolubility and stability, there is also the idea that the Tsar is trying to build a rule around his pious qualifications and around identifying his reign with the rediscovery of Russian saints. So if sainthood is to become so inexplicably associated consciously and posthumously with Nicholas II, how can we justify it? How can we justify, again, Russia in terms of culpability for the beginning of the First World War? That's a very long introduction, but Rupert, I'd love to get your thoughts on, well, any of those elements that I just brought up.
Yeah, that's quite a lot to chew on, but in particular, what caught my attention is you mentioning the nostalgia for the period before World War One, which it is worth bearing in mind throughout, and it'll come up again, I'm sure, that and I think it's very relevant to the Russian perspective as well, is that basically everyone wanted this war, even people who almost immediately then decided that it was a bad idea and then tried to go on record as saying that they were always against it. Like most of the big pacifists, especially the high-profile pacifists, were also in favor of the war, and that's on all sides. That's not just a Russian point. And everyone saw what they wanted to see in it as well. So the sense in which people were either bored or unsatisfied with the old world that people subsequently are nostalgic about is something that is very much worth bearing in mind. And again, that's like all stratas as well. So yeah, it was an extremely popular war in the very early stages.
Well, by implication, again, the entirety of European civilization is in some way implicated by that assessment. But of course, the emphasis specifically on focusing in the Tsar is how can you have, again, a sainted war where we're talking ultimately about incredibly nebulous and ultimately expansionist foreign policy goals that lean on causes which I can't identify seriously as Christian in the instances of any of these causes, even if we're going to talk about the issue of the Straits and Tsargrad towards the end.
Oh, well, I mean, sorry, if just quickly, if you accept their propaganda views, their espoused views on this, then it's to fight godless socialism. That was essentially the thrust. They portrayed Germany as a socialistic, bordering on communistic, atheist hellscape that needed to be sort of purged.
Whilst also being aligned with the great internationalist Republican forces in France.
Of course, yes.
So,
I mean, it's certainly
so yes, exactly. The more you sort of delve into it's why I was playing around earlier on with the whole notion of the war, the great, the second patriotic war that never was, and Stalin, ironically enough, was able to assume that mantle, and the Pan-Slavic War. Is if you're looking for any meaning in the sort of post hoc or during the time, it falls apart almost immediately. And again, the irony of this is we're going to get into the whole sort of degeneration of Prussian socialism or whatever, technocratic sort of modernist socialism in Germany was essentially Bismarck's creation. And Bismarck was this last sort of great conservative in foreign policy in terms of trying to reify the era of Metternich. And again, one of these few politicians who perhaps again was aware of the utility of a conflict, but also wanting to avoid a conflict with Russia. But we come back to this idea of a history of aggression. This is going to be focusing, of course, on Russian history more consummately. And if, again, Russia is to involve itself in a war of aggression, why would that be? And also, we have to consider this within the context of a lot of modern historians and a lot of foreign policy analysts and political scientists of all stripes taking this issue very, very seriously, and I would say in some degrees hysterically, given what's been going on in Ukraine over the last 12 years in particular, but especially over the last 4 years. And the first segment of an article I have is by one Igor Zevelev in the article Russian National Identity and Foreign Policy. In the view of political and historical narratives that have been dominant in Putin's government's rhetoric for about 2 decades, what is puzzling in retrospect is not how dramatically Russian foreign policy changed after 2012, but rather why it hadn't happened sooner. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, a broad range of conceptions about Russian identity have surfaced in official and public discourses. Yet in the past several years, Russia's ruling elite eventually opted for ideas that were instrumental in legitimizing a new regime, consolidating a country's sovereignty, securing strength and influence of the Russian state. 2 ideas were proven critical. The first implies that Russia must be a strong and independent great power, a stronghold for all conservative forces that oppose revolutions, chaos, and liberal ideas imposed on the world by the United States and Europe. The second idea claims the existence of a greater Russian world, Ruski Mir, that transcends Russia's state borders and of a Russian civilization that differs from Western civilization. These ideas do not easily coalesce with a dominant Western discourse and have been perceived in the West as intellectually archaic and atavistic. However, the divergence did not pose any immediate danger, as far as, again, Western analysts are concerned, to the international system or to European security until the annexation of Crimea in 2014. This explains why Moscow's actions with regards to Ukraine were completely unexpected to many Western leaders and experts. They had not delved into Russian domestic identity discourses, which have grown isolated from global trends. Discussions about the Russian national identity did not have much to do with Russian foreign policy or the security agenda. The mass protests in Russia and revolution in Ukraine allowed, and from the Kremlin's perspective, forced Russia to securitize the question of identity. That is, to make one of these issues critical for the survival of the Russian nation and statehood. What is interesting about this in terms of focusing the ideas on making a conservative stronghold, an anti-revolution stronghold, and having an identity which is in specific contrast to the West, of course, is exactly the same arguments that were revolving around Russia in the late 19th century, throughout most of the 19th century, in fact, and throughout the earlier 20th century. And indeed would then form part of the mentality of fortress socialism, even under the Soviet Union, which expressed itself as a progressive and anti-capitalistic force in many ways. So what we're almost seeing in terms of this identification is a return to form within Russia. Hence why I'm talking about these sort of permeability of these ideas and how they seem to be refashioned under different guises throughout all of history. The main difference, however, between now, you can say, and the First World War is that ostensibly, again, Russia's foreign policy antics and the way it conducted great power international relations was the norm. Whereas from the point of view, especially of the Francis Fukuyama types in terms of the end of history, this form of great power politics and diplomacy simply does not exist and cannot exist in the modern day in a period of international superstructures and law. But perhaps again, it's revealing that this form of World War I-esque foreign policy never died. It was simply remanifested in a new form when it came to Russia. But all this, again, is to identify the specific, you can say, contrast juxtaposition between Russia and its identity vis-a-vis the West. This, of course, wasn't lost during the Cold War. It was simply placed under a different sort of ideological schema. But again, as far as sort of Western commentators are concerned, therefore, looking at Russia's reasoning to go to war in the First World War becomes that much more interesting again, because it seems that we're talking about a very sort of similar set of arguments.
Yeah, in particular, the image of Russia as if we're using the kind of framing that you spoke about of being like the perennial warmonger and the kind of constant threat, that goes back at least to the 1820s or 30s in the British context, at least. And yeah, obviously it kind of gets switched between the various polities that encompass Russia or that control the Russian space, I guess we could say, whether or not they have a Russian character, but the conscious connections will always be made, and so there's often a slip between Soviets and Russians to try and draw that continuity.
The roots of current discussion on Russian identity could be traced back to the 19th century between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. Slavophiles emphasized the unique character of Russian civilization based on Slavonic Orthodox communitarian traditions. It also opposed alien Western civilization, its alleged rationalism and faceless codified laws. In contrast, the Westernizers argued that Russia should emulate and learn from the rationalism of the West. The problems of the Russian Empire's multi-ethnicity, interactions between Russians and other peoples, the frontiers of the Russian people played no significant role in these debates, establishing a tradition for many Russian intellectuals. Characteristically, the specific problems of Russia's national minorities were first raised in a relatively consistent theoretical manner, not in the intellectual salons of St. Petersburg and Moscow, that being the Russian imperial capital, but in Kiev. For the Brotherhood of St. Cyril and Methodius, led by a Ukrainian poet and public figure, Taras Shevchenko, and a Russian student of Ukrainian history, Nicholas Kostomarov, in 1846, these debates could hardly countenance the separation of the Slavs. In fact, Shevchenko and Kostomarov elaborated the idea of a pan-Slavic federation of liberal states, including Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Bohemia, Serbia, Bulgaria. And really, I'm going to be bringing up a lot of maps involving the Pan-Slavas. This is the first one in terms of superimposing modern borders, and I've included a sketch of the boundaries of then Austria-Hungary, which was going to be the main victim alongside the Ottoman Empire of this Pan-Slavist agenda. And you can see it here again with the black line in terms of indicating some sort of continuous Pan-Slavic state of which Russia would expand to, and those borders again superimposed in the borders of Austria-Hungary. All this is to say, however, notice the emphasis on it being a political movement, a liberal political movement that was identified with, again, more or less Ukrainian figures. And I'm going to actually say proto-Ukrainian figures, because as I've placed in my my own sort of consistent argumentation across this channel, a nomenclature about Ukrainian nationality didn't really exist until the late 19th century, and it originated in the city of Lemberg in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not within Russia itself. But what is being emphasized here is that if there is an expansionist tendency within Russia towards the unification of Slavic peoples in terms of reifying a new Slavic identity vis-a-vis the Ottomans or the Germans, then this identity would actually have to acquire a more grassroots and, dare I say, democratic impetus, that it would be a democracy in terms of being a realization of a Slavic identity, a national community, a Slavic Volksgemeinschaft, for, again, a lack of a better description, and how Slavism can actually be placed in opposition to Tsarism, because as we all know, the Russian Empire, looking at this map and how many countries it overlaps with, was not a overwhelmingly Slavic state. It was only had a plurality of Slavs within the empire, and it didn't even have a overwhelming majority of Orthodox. There were also a significant number of Muslims, Protestants, Catholics, and of course Jews existing within the empire as well. And so even when talking about figures like Putin today, who tend to advocate some form of civic nationalism, Tsarism and Putinism in a weird way actually appeal to both of these aspects in terms of not appealing to ethno-nationalism or sort of a democratic grassroots pan-Slavism in a way, because again, this would actually be contrary to Russians' reason of state, for lack of a better expression. In 1869, Nicholas Danielewski, in his Russia and Europe, tried to fuse Slavophilism, pan-Slavism, and a policy of imperialism. In other words, trying to identify pan-Slavism with a policy of Russian expansion only came decades later. Essentially, Danielewski recast the liberal pan-Slavic idea in conservative and imperialist thought. Slavic culture, in Danilevsky's view, could serve as a basis for Russian leadership of a newly created federation of Slavic peoples, whose capital would, of course, be in Constantinople, Tsargrad, the city of the Tsars, and the second Rome for the Orthodox Commonwealth, and perhaps the most significant city to Orthodoxy in particular. Emphasis also on the year 1869, as we're going to get into, and how that mirrors German unification at the same time. You can say that Pan-Slavism originates as a democratic revolution alongside that of the revolutions of 1848 and the attempt to create a liberal bourgeois German unity. And we have the exact opposite occurring with figures like Palatsky in Prague, with Croatian nationalists, with Slovak nationalists, and indeed Polish nationalists in particular, and how in many cases Russian Tsarism and Prussian statism would try and assume control over these forces.
Just quickly before we get too far away from it, so Pan-Slavism is obviously more relevant because it continues to be a more sort of ongoing force, but the element of Orthodox Brotherhood is also sort of relevant here as well. So that's how Romania becomes a big concern of Russia as well. Not necessarily, I don't know if there was ever actually any proposals to create a kind of united Orthodox state per se, but they do consistently try to maintain good relations with all Orthodox states, and so they are also very concerned with for example, Greece. Famously, they're the protectors of especially the Orthodox Christians, but Christians in general, I believe, in the Ottoman Empire, which is a concession that they got in the 18th century, I believe. And then over time, that kind of morphs more into being a concern for Slavs, Orthodox Slavs, especially in particular. But yeah, there is that other component.
Well, it's very important. Yeah, sorry, I'll let you finish your point.
I was going to say just one other quick thing about Pan-Slavism, which is interesting to note, especially in the Russian context. So you've emphasized the Ukrainian element there, but there was also a tradition that a lot of the more liberal Pan-Slavists were looking back to, which is that of Novgorod. So Novgorod versus Moscow, and basically treating the Muscovite system as more of a Asiatic import. To my mind, from what I read of it, that it involves a fair amount of pseudo-history, which is still kind of like touted around today. But there is some truth to they could make credible claims about things like serfdom being a Western import, and looking at the legal codes of places like Novgorod, and trying to claim that essentially modern, by 19th and perhaps even early 20th century standards, liberal thought was completely compatible with traditional Novgorodian style Russian law and civil liberties and all that kind of thing. Obviously, in a much more primitive form.
This all stems from the same central conceit, is that Muscovy is implicated as being the autocratic anomaly within Rus or Rusine history, and that would actually connect with Kiev as well. So we have, as mentioned, the Brotherhood of Saint Cyril and Methodius, but we also have the Horodnos. We have these great sort of agrarian societies as they're originating in Ukraine, re-emphasizing, you could say, the Ukrainian roots or the Proto-Ukrainian. These would be like the Little Russian or Ruthenian roots of Pan-Slavism, would also link back to the idea of when Kiev and Novgorod were the two great cities in Rus civilization, and Muscovy only comes about as a result of the aftermath of the Mongolian conquests in the 13th century. So all of these are sort of linking back to the same central idea, which is trying to exercise Moscow, or if anything, bring Moscow kicking and screaming into a greater sort of more democratically aligned pan-Slavic rejigged identification. So all of these things are relevant. However, I think the reason, again, this starts in the region which would later become Ukraine, as opposed to Novgorod, is that in Ukraine you have the examples of the Cossack and Cossack identity, which is basically a tradition more akin to what we see with the Wild West in America, which is of these more or less semi-autonomous communities living in opposition, you can say, to a more stratified hierarchical society that we see in the court culture in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Whereas in Novgorod, again, you have to extrapolate based on a history that preceded, say, for example, the purge and decimation of Novgorod by Tsar Ivan the Terrible. But all this history is, again, actually identifying the same point, is that Novgorod was placed as the enemy of Tsarism in all of these instances.
Just as a side point, there's another interesting comparison with the Cossacks, which is that especially early on, as I understand correctly, if I understand correctly, there's a comparison to be made with sort of like holy orders as well. There was a very significant sort of like almost monastic component where I believe, for example, they weren't allowed to have women on the camp, and they're so they were strictly martial brotherhoods, and the discipline was both incredibly harsh and incredibly rigid. So that is potentially another way of thinking about it. And then later it kind of takes on more of a Wild West kind of connotation of there being a lot of wealth around and a lot of freedom that didn't necessarily exist in the early stages.
Regarding your point about orthodoxy, again, in terms of trying to pivot back to a quote-unquote tradition of Russian expansionism or Russian aggression, yes, you're correct in terms of looking at 18th century and the policy of Catherine the Great as being associated with trying to establish rights for the orthodoxy within the Ottoman Empire. I believe it's the Treaty of was it Kujay in 1774, which precedes the direct annexation of Crimea by Russia by Catherine the Great, which asserts the role of the Russian Tsar over orthodoxy. And regarding the annexations of Romania, the ideas for annexing Romania, or what were then called the Danubian principalities, to Russia were far in advance of all of these ideas about liberating all of the Slavs, say, for example, within Austria-Hungary, which was then just the Habsburg monarchy or Austria, and of course in the Greater Ottoman Empire. Pan-Slavism, of course, as with most forms of post-French Revolutionary nationalism, are far more secularistic. They emphasize the secular national ethnic cohort, or historically sort of rejigged or imagined community, above that of religion. And so as religion, again, recedes in the course of the 19th century, then nationalism basically comes to superimpose itself upon national identities and self-consciousness. And that's why we, say, for example, see Pan-Slavism as being a very strong force in Catholic countries, like in Austria-Hungary, and indeed in areas like Poland, albeit Poland is one of these interesting instances, because I think it's fair to say that Polish identity has almost consistently throughout its history always superseded Pan-Slavic identity. And you could say one of the main focuses of that, of course, is not only was Poland a great power in its own right and an independent nation, but it was also Catholic. And so a large element of Pan-Slavism would have to be overcoming Catholicism, which again is where we get Tsarism coming into opposition, serious opposition with Pan-Slavism, when we turn, as we always do on this channel, back to orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Russian policy in the 19th century was not driven so much by these ideas about Russian culture or Pan-Slavism per se, but by a doctrine of official nationalism, formulated by Sergei Uvarov, orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, claimed as the pillars of the empire. The third principle, Narodnost, nationality, was the most ambiguous, especially after the Polish Revolt of 1830 and the nationalization of ethnic groups in the second half of the 19th century. Indeed, that should be, you can say, the emphasis: orthodoxy first, then autocracy, and then nationality. And as we say, for example, get towards the 20th century, it's unclear whether nationality, say for example, has come to actually rival orthodoxy within that trifactor. But in the 1830s, when this idea was essentially being formulated as a state doctrine, it was very clear that nationality was an afterthought in many of these cases, because like with the church itself, which had become basically an arm of the state during Peter the Great's reforms, nationality was going to be an extension of the definition given to it by the autocracy, not given to it by some sort of imagined or sort of democratic momentum from below. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no disagreements here. The only thing I was gonna add was your point on Poland. I'd add a little caveat that they are very inclined towards, although that same conflict is still there between Pan-Slavism and Polish nationalism, even in the republics. But the contention that they have is that Poland should form the senior partner in any Pan-Slavic union in the region, and that somewhat includes, or occasionally includes, Russia, as has been mentioned in the chat.
Well, the funny thing is that actually goes back to my original point about the whole Pan-Slavic lie of the justification for the First World War, is that if you look at the First World War as this great contest between Slavs and Germans, then by the 1920s, it actually becomes a contest between the two great Slavic powers, Poland and now the Soviet Union. And so what does Poland do? Again, in accordance with your line of thinking, Poland tries to present itself as the main power, essentially between France and the Soviet Union. It tries to establish itself basically as the protector of the Little Entente and the Baltic states and countries like Romania. So yes, it never abandons these pretensions, essentially, that were in vogue among the sanitation government and Pilsudski, etc. And how do you refer to it? There's a specific word that I've completely forgotten in terms of Pilsudski's policy. I've done a whole stream on it, so I should remember it.
Prometheanism?
Yes, Prometheanism, thank you. So yes, but I think we're getting away from the causes of the First World War, so I want to focus again back on Russian identity and looking at these various conflicting causes for Russian quote-unquote aggression in the 19th century. And just to clarify on orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, this is comes from an article by Emil in quote-unquote Imperial Syndrome. On taking up office in 1833, the Minister of Education, Sergei Uvarov, declared the formula orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, the triad intended as an antithesis for the French Revolution's freedom, equality, fraternity, which in the minds of Russian conservatives of the early 19th century was inconceivable for the Russian people, with their own special spirit. The main innovation of Uvarov's formula was the concept of nationality, from which the entire doctrine derived its name as an official nationality. I've already sort of gone into what that really means. By this, it was understood first and foremost Russia's devotion to tradition and an original path as opposed to Western models. Within the framework of this doctrine, the idea of the nation was regarded as a manifestation of free thinking and troublemaking, and the concept of narodnost was specifically contrasted with it. First, narodnost, nationality in the trifecta, was identified as a Russian term in contrast with the foreign natia, nation. Second, as a concept, it was devoid of any democratic connotations or connections with national representation. On the contrary, it reflected a paternalistic idea of the ruler's concerns for his subjects. In other words, there can be no nation without the papa, without the Tsar. The ruler is father of the people, and his devoted children are piously aware and revere their autocratic father. Besides narodst, nationalnost was another term allowed by the censors and used in the 1830s to supplant the more seditious term of the nation. Count Peter Valuv, who became Minister of the Interior in the 1860s, had in the late 1830s frequented intellectual circles and written philosophical essays. One of these essays, Thoughts on Nationality, outlined why it was necessary to replace the concept of a nation as a particular politicized category with the concept of the nationalnost. This latter he presented as a native Russian concept, reflecting the specifics of the culture and rituals of the folk, understood in the way in which an ethnic community is defined today, as a group of people linked together by ideas about a shared origin and with their own name for themselves, an ethnonym. And again, this idea of nationalnost is actually, I would say, far more in keeping with modern Russian identity today, which again is why a lot more scholars, say, for example, are taking far more interest. It's not just figures like Sean McMeekin in the quote-unquote Russian causes for the First World War. Although the civic interpretation of the concept of nation was eventually entirely supplanted, linguistically it lasted almost 70 years. The new exclusively ethnic interpretation of this term appeared in Russia's political lexicon only in the mid-1860s. It had particularly negative connotations in the phrase of the national question, linked as it was to a perception of threats of national separatism in Poland and in Ukraine. Again, I would say proto-Ukraine. I have to keep emphasizing this because Ukraine is not a political fact in the 19th century. It's very much a coalescing of various ideas and thinkers. With each passing decade of Russian history, the national problem became more ethnically colored, increasingly being interpreted from an essentialist perspective as a certain selection of characteristics bestowed by fate upon a certain peoples, ethnic nations. From the end of the 1890s, Russian Slavophiles and their arguments with Westernizers began to develop Uvrov's idea of fundamental and everlasting preordained differences between the Russian people and the nations of the West. According to the Slavophiles, the Russian people rejected the burden of national representation in favor of their everlasting autocratic monarchy. In so doing, the Slavophiles of the 1890s rejected the legacy of their predecessors, the Slavophiles of the mid-19th century, who had opposed the doctrine of official nationality, which they saw as suffocating creative initiative. Sorry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add quickly, there's it's also worth noting that the Russian ethno-nationalist component, so the ethnic Russian nationalist, ethno-nationalist component is also considered a threat in this time period as well. So Mikhail Skobelev, who was a fairly high profile and popular general during during several wars, but most notably during the War of 1877, I believe it was, with the Ottomans. He was an outspoken Russian nationalist in the sense that we might recognize it, and he was sort of vilified for it. And there's even a conspiracy theory that he was essentially assassinated for posing a threat with ethno-nationalist beliefs.
Yes, I would say it's almost impossible. I would say it is inexplicable today for most thinkers dealing with Russia, as it was perhaps for most Westernizers within Russia, or most Westerners looking in on Russia in the 19th century, to really gauge what Russian nationality even is. But I will sort of focus again on this argument of there being the statist question, and in the case of the 19th century, the Tsarist question, and pertaining to a more popular nationality. And I will actually make the claim that Russian ethno-nationalism has never existed as a mainstream force within Russian history, whether that be within Tsarism, whether it be socialist communism, or whether it be with the Russian quote-unquote federation and Putinism.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't exist today, but I would perhaps say that there was a tendency towards that at the end, and I feel like you're sort of getting at that. But it does seem to me, and I'll sort of put this idea as a seed in people's minds, that the original version of official nationality comes across to me, at least, as an attempt to find some kind of an intellectual grounding and create an intellectual battleground where previously more liberal ideas had basically had a monopoly. So it's sort of, laying some kind of foundation for a counter movement within the intelligentsia, and kind of like something for the intellectuals and the academics to kind of chew on that would be more amenable to state interests. But then over time, it kind of develops more of a Volkish character, where it becomes much more concerned with things that we would later associate with Volkism, obviously in the Germanic context.
Yes, but I think in the case of Russia, we always have to sort of identify Russian nationalism as having a lot of very sort of multivariate threads going back to, you can argue, even before the Russian Tsardom, but you can also identify specific trends like the Old Believers against the Nikon reforms in the 17th century, sort of pure, quote-unquote, authentic Russian agrarian movements and things like that, and the Tsar's attempts to create, again, a loyalist cohort between agrarian nationalism and the Tsar, whether that be in the land captains of Alexander III or the Black Hundreds. You can say on the one hand, this represents, quote unquote, folkish identity. But as with all of these things, I think Russia has a very specific trajectory, and all of these national threads can link back to one of these traditions or another. The Slavophiles of the late 1890s and the early 1900s, referencing figures like Nikolai Danielewski, Konstantin Leontiev, I might actually do a whole episode on in the future, Vasily Rozanov and others, developed an idea of Russia's special path. It was this cohort of Slavophiles that began to contrast with the national special character of Russians as patient, thirsty for truth, spontaneous, warm, sincere, generous, and inclined to sobornost, a preference for collective decision-making. And again, this whole idea of collectivization goes back to, you can say, more idyllic models of agrarian proto-socialism and Cossack identity. In particular, there's a you can say that this is all sort of Rousseauian, but no, I would say Russian sort of collectivist sort of post-Tsarist thinking is far more organic and far less focus, you can say, of philosophizing as opposed to someone like Rousseau. And French identity, with a generic image of Western mentality. The latter they regarded as always intrinsically self-interested, greedy, deceitful, and coldly frugal. These latter Slavophiles harnessed the concept of the nation as an ethnic phenomenon permanently grafted to the body of a Russian people to preserve autocracy and imperial power. Referring back to Igor Zevelev and his conclusions on how this Russian nationalism bleeds into foreign policy, not just in terms of the 19th century and the 20th century, but also today, the element is on messianism, the idea that Russia has a spiritual or transcendent historical role to play on world affairs. In terms of the Tsar, this is explicit. In terms of the Third Rome, the idea that the First Rome, of course, is Catholic and thereby heretical, and the Second Rome actually forsook its true Orthodox identity, became a Catholic state, and then was conquered by the Turks to punish them for their perfidy. And so Russia assumes this messianic course of the Third Rome. The second element, as far as Zevelev is concerned, is the obvious Slavophilic opposition, juxtaposition to Europe. When I use these terms Slavophile, there should be an evidence already that Slavophilia is a very large umbrella term that encompasses many elements of Russian nationalist thought, and in many cases, contradictory elements of thought. And the final element for Zevelev is the ambiguous nature of what it means to be Russian and its relationship to its neighbors. This, you can say, ambiguous nature of Russian incorporates all the peoples who happen to exist within a Russian nation state. This would, say, for example, today include all the elements, say, for example, of the Siberian peoples, the Kazani peoples, Kalmucks, Caucasians, Ossetians. It doesn't sort of really, again, benefit this conversation to go in terms of a total list of all of these different quote-unquote minorities, but on the one hand, they are to be Russian. Yet on the other hand, people existing outside of the Russian state borders can also be Russian. Today, this would exist within certain parts of Ukraine, Belarusia, whatever, the Baltic states. In terms of the 19th century, this was in specific reference to areas across Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, not just Slavs, but also people who could be considered part of an Eastern Slavic patrimony, in particular, this little green area you see within the Golden Rim, which is East Galicia within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The origin, you can say, of Ukrainian nationality as a real sort of political force was also the object, you can say, of Pan-Slavism in terms of their justification for expansionism. And as we'll see, part of a hard strategic logic for expansionism, really going back to years before we had the July crisis. If Russia has to expand, it has to annex this region of Galicia in order to consolidate its regions elsewhere in Poland. And just again to confirm many of these arguments sort of brought forward regarding the monarchy and the problem of Russian nationalism, this is an article segment by Richard Wortman, who is really paraphrasing a book by Jeffrey Hoskins called Russia, People and Empire, which of course is linked in the description. The most cogent and compelling explanation for a weakness of quote unquote popular nationalism can be found in Russia, People and Empire by Jeffrey Hosking. Hosking attributes the absence of this type of nationalism to the existence of the Russian Empire, which was thwarted the formation of a nation state in Russia. Russian autocracy was generated by the needs of empire and had to be reinforced as that empire came increasingly into conflict with nation building. Hosking's thesis is that in Russia, state building obstructed nation building, and autocracy and backwardness were symptoms and not causes. Both were generated by the way the building of the empire had obstructed the formation of a nation. Hosking's thesis highlights a conflict between imperial and national designs amidst agency that apprehended and evaluated the needs of empire and persuaded the policies that generated the conflict. Presumably, the vast expanses of Eurasia, accompanied by a long power vacuum, thrust upon Russia an imperial destiny. A study of Russian monarchy has led to a different thesis in the case of Wortman, that it was the rulers of Russia who determined to build and rule an empire, who gave rise to a political culture governed by the imagery and designs of empire. From the reign of Ivan III, who in 1489 refused the title of king from the Holy Roman Empire with the declaration that he had never wanted to be made king by anyone, the rulers of Russia conceived of a monarchical sovereignty as imperial sovereignty. The word empire carried several connotations. First, empire signified dominion or supreme power unencumbered by other authority. Second, it implied imperial expansion, extensive conquests encompassing non-Russian lands. I'll bring up this map again to show the trajectory of Russian expansionism. Third, it created equivalents to other empires, the Roman, the Byzantine, the latter is the Christian Empire and the defender of orthodoxy, otherwise the Third Rome. These meanings were conflated and served to reinforce each other. The expansion of empire confirmed the image of a supreme power, justified by the unlimited authority of the Russian emperors, and endowed the Russian ruler with a standing equal or superior to that of the West. In the development of the Russian state, it was the supremacy and centrality of the monarchy that provided the principal determinant of state politics, the acquisition and defense of the empire, numbering among the attributes demonstrating the force and extent of its sway. The expansion of Russia in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries brought non-Russian territories under the authority of the Russian Tsars, emperors, and empresses referring to the 18th century in which the vast majority of Russian rulers were empresses, leading them to evoke comparisons with the empires of antiquity. In the period of the Western European kings adopted an imperial idea and the attendant imagery and ceremonies to consolidate their power over their separate realms, the rulers of Russia, unencumbered by internal religious wars and feudal rights, promoted the goals and policies of an expanding empire centered in the Russian capital. This elevated their authority, by assuming the images of Western ideas of rule. Peter the Great adopted the absolutism of Louis XIV, Catherine the Great, the persona of a philosopher king, Alexander I, an enlightened ideal of a centralized egalitarian government, like Frederick II of Prussia. By the same token, the national narratives and symbols adopted by the monarchy represented more than window dressing or drag. Rather, they expressed new conceptions of the role and destiny of a Russian monarchy as a symbol of the nation, counterpoised by popular nationalism of the West, conceptions that were shared by many educated Russians and members of the elite. Nationalism became a field of contestation between the monarchy and educated society, each claiming to represent the people in its struggle to control the state. The weakness of democratic nationalism owed not to the presence and needs of the empire, and not only to the aversion to constitutional government, but to the determination of the Russian monarchy to assume the mantle of nation and to resist and eliminate challenges to this prerogative. Indeed, you can see that part of the meta-narrative revolving around the causes of World War I is Russia and its monarchy trying to retain this prerogative of nationalism, and in many cases, you can say, in the end, arguably failing. In the case of Nicholas II. And the final point I want to bring up before we finally get to the narrative sort of through line arriving at World War I is the other perception, which is this is all talking about the central through line in terms of the tradition of quote unquote expansionism aggression vis-a-vis the Tsar, and by extension towards the end, arguments about justice and the Tsar being a sainted figure. But there is, of course, the other element that Rupert has already brought up and forms part, you could say, of the motivation to fixate on this tradition of aggression, which is Western perceptions of Russian expansionism, and by extension, Western hysteria over Russian expansionism, and the fact that this is nothing new. Indeed, in the last sort of article segment by Hugh Ragsdale, written just before the collapse of the Soviet Union, should be mentioned, he brings up instances where Alexander II was actually directly rebuking challenges about quote unquote Western hysteria regarding Russian expansionism in the 19th century. At the approach of the Balkan crisis of 1878, Tsar Alexander II undertook what must have seemed to be a Sisyphean labor of demonstrating again to the perpetually misguided British ambassador the elemental foolishness of European suspicions of Russia. By Sisyphean, we're talking about the man in Hades trying to push the boulder up in order to achieve his freedom, but inevitably the boulder will always fall down, and he will exist in that state for perpetuity, for eternity. Above all, Alexander said to the British ambassador, "You understand three things. The testament of Peter the Great does not exist. I will never make conquests in India, and I will never march to Constantinople." The testament of Peter the Great, again, is one of these documents where apparently, again, Peter the Great, who was expanding his empire into Livonia and into Azov on the Black Sea, and also, you can say, confirming the borders of China, was also trying to conquer the world by extension. And you could say part of this hysteria was then confirmed when Tsar Paul decided that he would send a Cossack army to invade India, which was logistically impossible and wouldn't have got sort of much further than Persia. But the whole notion that such an idea even existed, you can say, forms part of a backdrop for the quote-unquote great game between Britain and Russia in the 19th century. The Testament of Peter, of which Tsar Alexander spoke, was regarded as an authentic document revealing the genuine aims of Russia and, later, Soviet foreign policy, by statesmen from Napoleon and Talleyrand to Harry S. Truman in the Christian Science Monitor, and found it to be the motivation for the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. So this is going all the way up until 1979. The Russian threat to India was bandied about even more noisily. A British pamphlet of 1838, so this is way before the Crimean War even, listed Russia's conquest in Poland and the Ottoman Empire, and suggested that the same fate awaited the Caucasus, Persia, and Afghanistan. Then the Indus crossed. What is the rest? The flight of the Russian eagle into the heart of British India. Shall we abandon India to the mercies of the spoiler of Poland? The Tsarist threat to India was now regarded by historians as the stuff of chimera and hysterical propagandists. And indeed, you can say that actually no, that that sort of rebuke against hysteria of historians is now completely sort of being reaffirmed, you can say, in the last 12 years. The third item, which Alexander II mentioned, was the conquest of Constantinople. It was identified especially with the Greek plan of Catherine II, which was a plan, part of this orthodox plan of restoring a pseudo sort of Byzantine state, combined with the sort of Greek class from the Phanar district in Constantinople, the Phanariotes, but it basically came to nothing. That distributed in the annals of European diplomacy long after the age that generated it, that being the 1770s. In the words of Lord Palmerston, who was Foreign Secretary, then Prime Minister, it should be mentioned, during the Crimean War, no reasonable doubt can be entertained that the Russian government is intently engaged in the prosecution of those schemes of aggrandizement towards the south, which ever since the reign of Catherine have formed a prominent feature of Russian policy. And the fact the most remarkable modern research shows Russian motives at the time during Nicholas I, during the Crimean War, were entirely different. I bring up this article because I would say that the hysteria is somewhat justified in some ways, and yet you can say the counter narrative proposed that Russia was not really the aggressor in the Crimean War is also something that I've indulged in extensively. A couple of years ago, I made a video about Russia's greatest defeat. And in that video, I was talking a lot about Russian geopolitics and how, as you can see on this map, part of the logic was breaking out to the sea in one theatre or another. Peter the Great had broken out into the Baltic Sea, but the Baltic Sea was basically a localized sea and actually inhibited many of Russia's sort of great expansionist aims. It would have been better, say, for example, for Russia to annex parts of Norway in order to have better access to the Atlantic. By extension, it would have been better for Russia to, if it were to attack India and, say, for example, acquire modern Pakistan, acquire a port in the Indian Ocean. By the same extension, again, in terms of fulfilling the great nationalistic and orthodox goal of taking over Constantinople and the Straits, Russia could then have access to the Mediterranean. And of course, an argument which we're going to bring in with Nicholas II, annexing Manchuria and Korea and having access and becoming perhaps the definitive power on the Pacific coastline as well. So there is, yes, simultaneously this hysteria that Russia wants to achieve all of these things, and yet there is an undergirding logic to all of these things that will be entirely within Russia's interest to achieve these things. But when we're talking about Nicholas I, for example, Nicholas I has been typecast as one of the most expansionist and bigoted Tsars of all time, but who is perhaps, you can say, the most moderate in many ways of all of the Tsars, really going from the era of Peter the Great to Tsar Nicholas II, and the fact that the Crimean War, you can say, was much more about the Ottoman Empire being preserved within a Russian sphere of influence, and Britain and France trying to, again, restore their own interests and their own sort of power over the Straits and over Constantinople, and making it into a Franco-British puppet, effectively, which it was. That is what has been referred to by these arguments. But the issue is, again, is that Alexander II may attempt to present himself as, you know, an innocent bystander of the chauvinistic and hysterical designs of the West. But at the same time, there is an element of truth in all of these claims. And by far, in terms of the tradition of expansion, when we're going to arrive at the July crisis, it arrives at this logic where Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire need to be dismantled.
Yeah, just to give an example of the kind of hysteria on the political stage, at least, that we're talking about vis-a-vis, well, Britain especially, is the argument. One of the main arguments that was used by Disraeli to intervene in the Great Eastern Crisis against Russia was the idea that the only thing standing between Russia and India was Constantinople. Therefore, they can't be allowed to have it. I think that's a pretty unreasonable. Well, hopefully, I'm not being unreasonable in saying that that's a pretty outlandish claim to make. But I don't know. It certainly seems to have had some purchase.
And indeed, these are the central elements. I would say the issue of the Straits never goes away. And it's something that everyone needs to sort of bear in mind, the idea of Russia taking over Constantinople. Really, you can say ever since the inception of Tsarist Russia, or even before, in 1547, Tsar Ivan the Terrible was crowned as Tsar of Russia, and later on, I think it was Alexei, would assume the title of Tsar of all the Russias, because they had just reincorporated elements like Kiev into the Russian Empire at that time. But with the sort of myth making, you can say, about Russia in the 1470s and the 1480s, with a great gathering of lands, you can see on this map again, which really consolidated a Muscovite Russian empire identity around a strong ruler. It all links again back to this idea that Russia is sort of more truer to the spirit of orthodoxy than Constantinople itself. And as Constantinople is held by the Turks, it is again, going back to this idea of messianism in Russian history, that it is, again, the duty of Russia eventually to return to Constantinople. The interesting thing is that over the course of the next sort of 600 years, Russia never does so, albeit you can say it comes closest during the First World War. In terms of trying to set up a narrative, I want to begin with the 1870s, with this sort of period of the Balkan crisis, which you've alluded to, but also talking about a little novelty, and you can say a historical irony regarding the creation of Germany, and the fact that, again, Russia and Germany would emerge as adversaries on the 1st of August 1914, which is my belief, and maybe Rupert, you'll push back against this, that Germany was unified with Russia's acquiescence, and had Russia not acquiesced to basically Prussian Bismarckian plans in the 1860s, Germany would not exist or come to exist in the way that we know it. And this centered on the question of suppressing Polish identity. Bismarck was resolute in terms of suppressing Polish identity, because also there was a significant Polish section within Prussia itself, whereas the French, foolishly, under Napoleon III, had actively promoted not just the anti-Russian cause in the Crimean War and fought in the Crimean War, but also the cause of Polish liberation in 1863, thereby making it basically impossible for the Russians to form an alliance with the French, as they would do 30 years later. So we sort of begin this conversation by talking about German unification as essentially being, in many ways, a Russian gift in terms of their non-intervention towards Austria and towards Russia. Yet at the same time, Russia would instantly feel the effects of German unification.
Yeah, definitely no disagreements there. But I'd add the other interesting comparison of Austria, the Austrian Empire as well, who was doing a similar kind of thing, albeit for different reasons. That they were suppressing the Polish nobility to some extent via the patronization of the more predominantly Ukrainian peasantry as a kind of more loyalist group to somewhat marginalize the most powerful and potentially threatening members of the Polish contingency in their, or the Polish contingent in their empire, and eventually also the annexation of the Free State of Krakow that was otherwise a bit of a thorn in the side of Russia in particular, I believe.
Well, this comes, first of all, I'll complete the German thought, which is the immediate reverberation of German unification is that obviously Bismarck had pursued and will continue to pursue a very pro-Russian course in foreign policy up until his dismissal as Chancellor in 1890. But immediately following unification, we begin to see a more aggressive process of Russification within Russia, which is significant because it brings to fore the element which we've basically talked about ad nauseum now, which is the Russian Tsar and his relationship towards ethno-nationalism. The minute Germany is unified, Alexander II begins to assume a more outwardly ethno-nationalistic posture, albeit under the guise and direction of the Tsar himself. So we have the suppression of Ukrainian identity through the infamous Elm's Ukaz. But we also have, you can say, the elimination of many of the rights that had been afforded to the Baltic German nobility ever since Peter the Great had acquired those regions during the Great Northern War of the early 18th century. So there was this awareness, perhaps for the first time in Russian history, that the Germans who had been welcomed in and annexed into various parts of the Russian Empire for the last 200 years could now potentially be fifth colonists if ever there were to be a war between Russia and Germany, because the Germans, for the first time in their history, had a ethnic nation state for which they could belong, which also posed questions for Austria and its relationship with Russia as well. But regarding Russia and its relationship with Austria-Hungary, it comes to the fore in the creation of the quote-unquote Three Emperors League. For reference, in the aftermath of the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, the great coalition powers had been Great Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And the three latter powers formed a holy alliance. You had a Protestant king, a Catholic emperor, and an Orthodox Tsar promising to uphold a conservative order around basically European strategic concerns and sort of ideological cohesion. The greatest sort of element in terms of exhibiting this alliance was during 1848, 1849, where Tsar Nicholas, the aforementioned, the very sort of conservative Tsar, intervened against the Hungarian revolutionaries within the Austrian Empire at that time to crush that revolt and help restore fully to power the new emperor, Franz Joseph. And you can say again, this was the greatest possible exhibition of the spirit of the Holy Alliance, which Bismarck would later try to revive. The issue is, immediately after, during the Crimean War, Austria did not join sides with the Russians against the British, the French, and the Savoyards. Rather, they assumed a position of, I'm not even going to say neutrality, I would say non-belligerence towards Russia, which was sort of semi-hostile and involved trying to evict the Russians from what was then Romania, the Danubian principalities, in order to assert their own dominance in that region, which Austria gained nothing for this apart from the eternal enmity of the Russians. So with that consideration in mind, when Bismarck was trying to restore this relation in 1873, just after German unification, the Russians had very little to gain out of this situation. Bismarck was trying to juggle a alliance with Austria for various reasons. Why didn't the new Germany simply dismantle Austria? Why didn't it create a new Hungarian identity, which will be allied to Germany? Why didn't it simply annex Bohemia and Slovenia and Austria itself and the Tyrol, and let Russia annex Galicia, the Polish and the Ruthenian populations within Austria? It did so because Bismarck had no interest in creating, as with the Tsars, a ethno-state for Germany. He wanted rather a Prussian-dominated feudal monarchical union, which was preeminent in Europe. And so long as Austria remained aligned and deferential towards Prussia, this conservative vision of German unification could be sustained. But that also essentially meant that Russia had to buy in to this alliance configuration that suited, first and foremost, the needs of Prussia.
Also remember, for domestic purposes for Bismarck, if to whatever extent he annexed German lands of Austria-Hungary, they would be Catholic, and therefore somewhat more antagonistic to the blocs that Bismarck was trying to form and maintain.
Indeed, he had enough headaches, you can say, in terms of trying to appeal to the Bavarians, let alone also trying to appeal to the Austrians at the same time. But the whole notion is that if we're going to look at Bismarck and we're going to look at Tsar Alexander in many ways as parallels in this situation, the more the argument was conceded that there should be a nationality based on ethnic cohesion above all else, then the argument also follows that there is no God-given right for the King of Prussia to be Emperor of Germany, and we can elect him. This was the argument essentially that was presented in 1848, 1849 during the revolutions. It was the argument that the Prussians toyed with for a while. They even tried to evict Austria from the German Confederation, but that failed. So yes, Prussia is dealing with the same forces that Russia is. It's trying to not pander too excessively to ethno-nationalism in order to maintain Prussian, and by extension Hohenzollern, that's the royal family in Prussia, their dynastic supremacy over the new German state. So this comes to a fore with the Balkan crisis, which you've already alluded to it in many ways. The Balkan crisis, the Ottoman Empire, as you can see on this map, which was after the Balkan crisis, should be mentioned, had controlled the Balkans for centuries up until this point. They've made their first major inroads and expansion into the 14th century. It is now the 19th century, 500 years later, and there was this major rebellion in Bulgaria. It's repressed brutally. It causes a massive cause célèbre for the Bulgarians throughout Europe, especially against the Bulgarian irregulars, the Turkish Albanian irregulars, the Bashi Bazouks who were employed against the Bulgarian civilians. And reluctantly, you can say, off the back, you can say, of trying to appeal to that popular sentiment, the same popular sentiment that had already led Alexander II to actually employ some Russification elements within Russia by completely U-turning his stance, say, for example, on the Germans within the Russian Empire, but also trying to repress elements, you can say, of nascent proto-Ukrainian identity, was in also appealing to Bulgarian and Orthodox sentiments, appealing to that same argument that you've already alluded to about Russia being the natural protector of Orthodox subjects within the empire. The same argument, it should be mentioned, that Nicholas I used in order to present the Ottoman Empire as a natural subject of Russia at the same time. This led to the conditions of war in 1877, a war that, it should be mentioned, that Russia didn't do as well as people were expecting her to do. There was the famous siege at Plevny, held up by Osman Pasha, which lasted for 4 months. That was long enough to allow essentially popular opinion throughout the rest of Europe to become less concerned about Turkish atrocities and more concerned about Russian expansionism. The reason this war is significant in many respects is because it actually reflects a radical departure in what had been Russian policy towards the Ottomans for nearly a century up until that point. We are presented in the West this narrative that the Crimean War was about Russian expansionism into the Ottoman Empire, where that simply isn't the case. Since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Russian policy had been towards preserving the Ottoman Empire, not dismantling it. Alexander I had not supported the Greek War of Independence for that exact reason, even though the Greek independence fighters, especially Ypsilantis, believed that the Russians would invade alongside a Greek national revivalist movement. No, The Russians only intervened in the very late stages of the Greek War of Independence, once Britain and France had already intervened on the side of the conflict, and once it again seemed that there was going to be a genocide committed in the Peloponnese, which is very interesting, that Russia, again, was a reluctant, you could even say passive actor in terms of getting involved in the Balkans. The Crimean War, of course, sort of follows along the same line, the Russians believing that the Ottoman Empire should be preserved, but under Russian influence and sway, and the British basically forcing a new situation in the Balkans where it'll be a Franco-British protectorate, the Ottoman Empire, and no longer a Russian protectorate, and that the Russians should suffer the humiliation of not only losing Sevastopol and the Crimea, but they should also lose access to a Black Sea fleet and basically be at the mercy of the British and the French going forward. So when we have the invasion by Alexander II and his desire to actually carve up a new state, a Bulgarian state, in 1877, 1878, it actually, you can almost say it reflects a return to form in some senses, in the fact that with the Greek plan, with Alexei Orlov and Suvorov's campaigns of the late 19th century, Russia had been expanding into the Ottoman Empire. Yet there's also a radical element to it, which is the Russian Empire is not expanding into the Ottoman Empire solely to annex land. It's doing so for the purpose of creating a new nation state, which is Bulgaria, which is assumed again to be favorable to Russia because of this pan-Slavic Orthodox community or identity. And it's this fear that Bulgaria, this new sort of emancipated nation within the Balkans, would serve the interests of Russia. That we have the Balkan crisis, we have the intervention of Disraeli, and we have what was then a much larger conceived Bulgarian state, which had access to the Mediterranean and more or less dominated the Balkans, would instead be severely truncated, and the area of which Russia would have influence would actually only be over half of the province of Bulgaria. The rest of it, Rumelia and Macedonia, was returned to the Ottoman Empire. Why this is significant in terms of coming to the question of personalities is that, again, you can say this reflects many sort of conflicting elements within Russian foreign policy. I've already alluded to many, but the figure on the left you can see is Alexander Gorchakov, the famous Russian foreign minister who was basically the sole Russian foreign minister throughout the entire reign of Alexander II. His actual aim was far more modest, and you can say the creation of this vast Balkan-spanning Bulgarian empire, which was the reconquest of the region of Bessarabia, which had been lost partly during the Crimean War, and he achieved those aims. So really, the Treaty of San Stefano, expanding this great Balkan empire through Russian influence, was a dream. It was this sort of pan-Slavic dream, which sort of Russia was sort of, whipped along with. And the frustration, again, that the British intervened and did so relatively decisively in order to prop up the Ottoman Empire, was seen as a great affront to Russian national prestige and popular sentiment, and in particular, you can say populist sentiment within Russia. But it wasn't that much of a negative effect in terms of Russia's overall strategic goals within that region. So again, we're seeing the conflict between Tsarist and Russian stated aims versus this pan-Slavic, Slavophile mentality.
Another interesting personality to bring up in all this is Count Ignatieff, who was the Russian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the time of the Great Eastern Crisis. He's very relevant because he's one of the foremost, you could call him like an extremist pan-Slavist, and I believe he might even have been the one who coined the idea and certainly promoted to them the idea of Bulgaria being the Prussia of the Balkans, which we take to mean militarism usually, but my understanding is that it was meant to be an allusion to Germany and that they would be the ones to unite the South Slavs under a form of Russian patronage. And then the slightly more forgotten moniker of Piedmont of the Balkans, which was applied to Serbia, which I think was also coined by Ignatieff, but I don't remember that one quite so specifically. again, trying to point to Piedmont's Piedmont Sardinia's role in unifying Italy. So he was really personally active in spreading and kind of like cultivating the Pan-Slavic movement among the South Slavs. And so I would be inclined to think, especially due to his efforts to try to enlarge Bulgaria as much as possible, even via some sometimes fairly underhanded means during the various negotiations. I think that was probably his project. And so if you could put it down to one person, you know, the fire that was Pan-Slavism in especially the southern and eastern, you know, the more orthodox South Slavs. He's a guy whose name you can put to it quite specifically.
Well, the fascinating thing about Ignatieff is that he is one of these instances of basically a minister going rogue. It's not just that San Stefano, the bigger Bulgaria that we see, was in many ways his creation, but he basically conceived of Bulgaria without consideration to the other nationalities or interests within this region. It was almost entirely Bulgarian-centered, which is why in many ways the Treaty of San Stefano was bound to fail. And again, this almost explicitly pro-Bulgarian policy, which, as I've referenced with Gorchakov and his far more moderate aims, made him so beloved of the Bulgarians that actually he was considered to be one of the candidates to become the first prince of the Bulgarians. So yes, on the one hand, you can say it was a personal triumph, but it also became in many ways a personal policy to create this greater Bulgarian empire. And so even though he came back and he was briefly made Minister of the Interior in Russia, he'd basically been forced out of frontline politics by the 1880s.
Yeah, that's the funny thing about viewing him as a kind of Bulgarian chauvinist, because from his perspective of being a kind of South Slav Pan-Slavist, or more general Pan-Slavist, it makes perfect sense to enlarge Bulgaria as much as possible if it's only going to be a stepping stone to uniting the whole South Slavs in general. It doesn't really matter what the ethnic composition of the state is, because you're going for more anyway. But yeah, had the byproduct of making him a Bulgarian icon.
Well, ideally, you'd want it to be Bulgaria, because in terms of, again, really trying to understand the dynamics of the Balkans, because it's so important to understanding Russia's reasons for getting into World War I, Serbia was at this time considered to be an Austrian puppet. Serbia was, as you can see on this map, it was actually smaller, far smaller, before the Balkan crisis of 1875. Was considered almost exclusively within Austria's sphere of influence. During the 18th century, the Austrians had regularly taken over Belgrade, and for a couple of decades, that area of Serbia had actually been part of the Habsburg monarchy. So the notion that Serbia at this time was going to be a vehicle towards Russian expansionism was frankly preposterous. So the idea of expanding Bulgaria in particular obviously had to be bound up with this idea of a Russian-sponsored Pan-Slavism. And it didn't really matter about the ethnic composition of the state. It didn't even really matter about the religious composition of the state. Bulgaria had included a huge number of Muslims, and if it expanded further west, a growing number of Catholics. But it also focused on this idea that as much as there was some to be, a great national restoration, a Slavic risorgimento, what better than to focus it on not just, the leading Slavic state, the leading Orthodox state, but a state which at one time during the medieval era had pretensions of replacing Greece and becoming a Slavic Byzantium, effectively taking over Constantinople. And in many ways, Bulgaria was the forerunner, you can say, of the Third Rome as, a Slavic creation rather than the Greek creation, well before Russia. We're talking about the 9th and the 10th centuries. We're not talking about the 15th century when we're talking about Russia and its imperialist ambitions. So in terms of history, medieval sympathy, reviving Bulgaria had all of these connotations and explicit associations of Pan-Slavism attached to it. The issue is, however, is that the more powerful and the more proud and mighty a Bulgaria state would emerge, the more it actually come into conflict with this idea of being a Russian puppet, which the Russians very much perceived it as being, which leads to the Bulgarian crisis just a decade later. But just before I move on from that, another element of this in terms of referring back to World War I and the Three Emperors League and why, again, it was a Bismarckian contrivance above all else, and why the Austrians, again, and the Russians weren't going to be forced into being happy partners within the situation. The Austrians, if there was going to be, again, an Austrian interest within this crisis, it was actually in terms of actually, as I mentioned, with going back to the 18th century foreign policy, part of the 18th century foreign policy of Austria and Russia towards the Ottoman Empire was carving out the Balkans for themselves. So Austria would gain Serbia, would also gain Bosnia-Herzegovina, while Russia would gain Romania, and it would gain the Bulgarian principalities, and of course it would gain the Straits, it would gain Constantinople. But in this situation, Austria began by thinking, okay, well, we might annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it becomes far more pusillanimous as the British become more involved. And when Bismarck decides to host the Great Congress of Berlin, which mediates this dispute between Russia and Britain primarily over the course of the Ottoman Empire, Bismarck does not pursue a rigidly pro-German line. Austria does not pursue, a pro-Russian line. Austria does not pursue a pro-Russian line. They become far more neutral and apathetic towards the situation in the Ottoman Empire. And so, again, this is a situation, what is the Three Emperors League for? What is the point of having a de facto alliance or preferable neutrality towards Austria and Prussia and now Germany if these states are not going to give Russia a carte blanche to pursue its interests in this region, which, as far as Ignatieff is concerned, is the expansion of Bulgaria to encompass most of the Balkans. And so already you can say that the Balkan crisis shows the first major cracks in this, I would say, very artificial alliance that was reconstructed. An alliance which is focused far more, you can say, on the conservative inclinations and anti-revolutionary inclinations of Franz Josef, Emperor Wilhelm I at that time, by extension Bismarck, and Alexander II. But Alexander II becomes assassinated, talking about these revolutionary elements, in 1881, and he is replaced by his son, Alexander III, who, again, pursues an interesting and you could say evolving Russian foreign policy that will ultimately move definitively away from the Three Emperors League and these conservative associations that were created by Metternich decades and decades before. I've already alluded to the Bulgarian crisis. What the Bulgarian crisis really amounted to is that when Bulgaria was finally conceded to be a nation state, as you can see on this map here, the actual territory which it was afforded was tiny compared to the expectation of this, third Bulgarian Empire that we see from the projected sort of boundaries of the map created by Ignatieff. Not only was this territory much smaller, not only did it not have Mediterranean access in a way that it could really menace Constantinople and dominate the Balkans, but only half of it was independent. The other half of it was still technically an Ottoman principality. And so in 1885 to 1887, there is a revolution occurring over this territory. And the Russians essentially respond by believing that the Bulgarians are going to revolt against the Russians, that they're doing this on their own initiative. There was even the fear that the Tsar, the prince at that time, not yet the Tsar, is going to rebel against the Tsar, and so he is deposed, Alexander of Battenberg, and he's replaced by a new prince, Prince Ferdinand, who would later become the first Tsar of the third Tsar of the Third Empire, Bulgaria. So that again already demonstrates, you can say, the friction within this pan-Slavic identity, which is, yes, it may on the one hand serve the interests or conceits of the Russians to direct this policy towards the liberation of the Slavs in the Balkans, yet at the same time, despite Bulgaria being essentially a Russian creation, a creation of Alexander II, they have their own national interests and their own desire to be autonomous, not just from the Ottoman Empire, but from Russia itself. Before I move on to the reinsurance treaty and the Straits, what do you have to really say about Bulgaria and its relationship towards Russia? And you can say how Bulgaria will revolt so decisively against Russia and end up being a member of the Central Powers.
Just, well, for one thing, by way of clarification to anyone listening who might not know, the Bulgaria of San Stefano encompassed on the right map pretty much all of the Adrianople province there, and most of the province of Slavonic just to the left of it. and also some of the bits further up in Romania on the left map that are inhabited by Bulgarians. So quite large, and it's noteworthy that Bulgaria spends pretty much the entire, well, a good chunk of the 20th century trying to get all those territories for itself. Yeah, I don't necessarily have that much else to say. I think you've covered most of it, except you know, it kind of almost seems like a problem where the Russians have kind of almost promised too much and are not able to follow through, to kind of like see some of that through, and eventually the Bulgarians kind of come to, well, in another way, it's almost weird that Bulgaria comes around to then be more aligned with the Ottomans, all things considered. But let me actually finish a thought. The sentiments towards Russia never really go away, and I think even as late as the 1940s, there's still, and right up to today, there's still widespread Russophilia in Bulgaria that is kind of related to this sort of kind of general folk sense of Russians being behind them, and that kind of feeds into. I think again, this is getting way out of scope of the lecture in general, but I think that ends up feeding some of the positive predisposition towards communism much later on as well, because it kind of has a national folksy component that is very much tied up with Russophilia, which I guess is the other side of the coin to the predominant feelings of, or the predominant feelings towards the various Russian polities in the West. Is you've got something similar in Bulgaria, but it's more of a philia rather than a phobia.
Yes, on the one hand, but I would say this has become very, very abstracted, not just in terms of the political sort of stance towards Russia, which was, we're talking about an explicit attempt at a Russian coup in Bulgaria in 1886. This isn't just a cooling of relations, this is an attempt at Russian regime change. And when they eventually do decide on a new ruler, they choose Ferdinand, as I referenced, of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, who was seen as far more Austrian aligned. He had in fact been a military officer within the Austrian army at this point. So, and there's also a course within Bulgarian history that it's not just the fact that there is a Russophilia attached to the idea that Alexander II is the Tsar liberator, but Alexander II is dead. Their relationship towards Russia of Alexander III has taken on a different course. And indeed, any attempts to liberalize Bulgaria, to make it more democratic, like a constitutional monarchy, invariably have an antipathy directed towards autocracy and Tsarism. So Bulgarian nationalism already has assumed this democratic element, which is not just trying to assert its own sovereignty vis-a-vis Russia, but is also trying to represent a different form of political configuration to Russia as well. So in terms of really what we're dealing with Russophilia, I would say it actually is expressed best through orthodoxy more than anything else. In terms of Bulgaria's own sort of relationship with the church, it's fascinating in the sense that the Exarchate and the Bulgarian Patriarchate, these are very old configurations going back to well before the Ottoman Empire even came into existence. And the idea of Bulgaria as the preeminent empire within the Balkans goes back all the way to the 10th century, the 9th and the 10th centuries. But nevertheless, this Orthodox connection, this Slavic Orthodox connection to Russia, I think, is the strongest element of this identity in terms of what you're trying to identify as Russophilia.
Yeah, you remind me of another point that I wanted to mention as well through all of this, is that one of the problems that Russia has in supporting these groups is that the nationalist types tend to also be more on the liberal side. And so, yeah, to what you're saying about movements towards or sentiments, nationalist sentiments towards a more constitutional monarchy, that is very much in keeping with the general sentiments of the people who are supporting a lot of these separatist movements in general. And so there is that conflict, especially because for both Greeks and to a lesser extent Bulgarians, I think, Serbs, Russia has quite a lot of these types within their own borders. And so supporting them too much kind of creates problems within their own borders, because they're also invariably liberals. And in favor of more liberal and democratic reforms.
And the ironic thing about all of this is going back to Alexander II as the Tsar liberator. There's a famous anecdote where he declared that I chose the path of popular sentiment and not the path of the princes, the princes of Europe, the governments of Europe, and I should have chosen the path of the princes. So again, it's this remorse from Russian foreign policy that if Bulgaria again was a Russian creation, they would soon again, in many ways, regret the creation of Bulgaria, as essentially was confirmed with the situation in World War One. But again, this whole idea of Russian foreign policy having to alternate between sympathy towards the princes and sympathy towards, again, popular sentiment reaches a head when we get to 1887, the Reinsurance Treaty. As I've already alluded to, Russia gains very little out of the Three Emperors League. It's very much, again, Bismarck's conservative formulation trying to revive the Holy Alliance, which had, in my opinion, the trust had been irrevocably broken in 1856. And in terms of saying, okay, this is ancient history, this happened 30 years before, Franz Joseph was the Emperor of Austria. It's the same ruler, and he'll be the same ruler that takes Austria up into the First World War. So in terms of the personnel leading this change, the same ruler is still there. So as far as the Russians are concerned, the antipathy is still legitimate in that sense. But the Reinsurance Treaty is fascinating in the sense that Bismarck is basically trying to dupe the Russians into retaining this pseudo-alliance by promising things he can't promise. On the one hand, it's basically saying, well, if there's a war between Russia and Austria, Germany will basically choose the side again, which will, he's basically promising two things in such a war that, again, he's promising to the Russians that he'll support the Russians. He's promising to the Austrians that he'll support the Austrians. Yet at the same time, Bismarck knows that in any real war conflict, he'll have to side with the Austrians because he has a far more formalized alliance with the Austrians. And indeed, in 1882, he'll form the Triple Alliance with Austria and Italy as well, whereas Russia's position in terms of this friendly configuration is far more nebulous. Really, what the Three Emperors League is just more of a friendly understanding or agreement. It relies upon this friendship of the princes, not popular sentiments or governments. In other words, it relies on Tsarist autocracy. It relies on the imperial sort of government of Germany and indeed the personality of Franz Joseph to hold these things together. Because the more, again, it becomes part of a formalized alliance system, the more it becomes part of this, you can say, considerations for popular sentiment and democracy, the more it's likely to fall apart, which is why part of the impetus behind the coalition against Bismarck that'll ultimately overthrow him when Kaiser Wilhelm II comes to power in 1888 through to 1890 is the belief that Bismarck is basically promising things which turns German foreign policy into a Gordian knot full of insurmountable contradictions. One of these insurmountable contradictions is Bismarck's belief that he can give Russia complete carte blanche in the Balkans, involving a German promise to turn a blind eye if the Russians were to annex the Straits, in other words, to annex Constantinople. Once Kaiser Wilhelm II becomes emperor in 1888, there is a very strong pro-English feeling within the German Foreign Office, and it's figures like Holstein in particular, who are leading the cause against the Russians, who believe that this policy to secure Russian interests in the Straits would basically result in a war between Russia and England, and Germany would rather sympathize with England in that situation rather than sympathize with Russia. We're also seeing the beginning of a far more extensive German interest in the Balkans and in the Ottoman Empire in general, which had never been the case before, as has been documented extensively, and I've referenced in other channels about Germany's relationship to Abdul Hamid II in particular, the Berlin to Baghdad railway, the visit to Jerusalem, the caliphatal idea. All of these things, you can say, are sort of indissolubly linked to the foreign policy of Wilhelm II in a way that all of these ideas were completely foreign to a figure like Bismarck. And so even though, again, Russia was interested in renewing the Reinsurance Treaty, the fall of Bismarck basically ensured that the Germans had no interest in pursuing this completely two-faced strategy towards the Russians, resulting in the collapse of this alliance. The more you sort of look into it, the failure of the restoration of the Holy Alliance, the more it seems to make sense, because it's founded again on trying to hold up so many contradictions within the sort of international order that was set up by Bismarck. But we can see now in hindsight, 25 years later, that it was one of the most significant events in European history, because the Russian sort of Austrian-German coalition alliance or favorable neutrality would never exist again.
Although the more I have kind of read about this and thought about it, the more I kind of do think it's less a heel turn, as is commonly described, and more just a continuity of what Bismarck himself had already sort of concluded, in that, yes, closer alignment and stronger alignment to Austria was going to be more so necessary, and maintaining the same accord with Russia was not going to be tenable in the long term once the secret alliance was revealed, and the intention that Germany would not actually follow through with promises to back Russia up in any theoretical conflict. And I think likewise that is also borne out later on when Kaiser Wilhelm is encouraging Russia's look towards the east, and then with implicit promises that they will back them up, and then completely failing to do so once there is a kind of threat that promise will be actually activated or called in.
I think that was the main sort of thrust of my argument, to be honest, which is that Bismarck was trying to paper over insurmountable differences, and it's only because of the presence of Bismarck personally that something like the Dreikaiserbund, the Three Emperors League, could exist in the first place. And it was an extension of, again, dynastic foreign policy. When Bismarck falls, we have to sort of consider again the nationalism argument, in Germany, the pan-Germanist and the pan-Slavic argument as well, is that from a nationalist point of view, there is every reason to form a friendly alliance with Austria over a situation like Russia, which, again, in terms of its culture, in terms of its religion, is completely at odds with Germany.
There is seemingly, though, a sense of shared concern about the kind of wider, we call it the West, but they wouldn't at the time, Western civilization, because, as I understand it, both Kaiser Wilhelm II and Emperor Nicholas II are concerned with, again, this is looking ahead from where we are on the timeline, but they're both concerned with the Yellow Peril, as it would be called at the time. And so the idea of trying to keep those forces in check and have that kind of common front is something that they could sort of not only bond over, but also it sort of could act as a method for pushing Russia out of becoming too entangled in European questions that might cause conflicts.
I just want to refer back to this mention of the Polish problem. The Polish problem, again, was the factor that united all of their empires in a shared desire to crush the restoration of any Polish sentiment. I believe this also forms the insurmountable differences in terms of Alexander II's brief, and you can say unfortunate indulgence of Ignatieff and Pan-Slavism in Bulgaria, is that if Bulgaria is suddenly restored onto the world scene, then all of a sudden that actually unmoors the situation in Poland. It makes the national situation in Russia more febrile, because the Ottoman Empire, despite again it being Muslim, is held up as one of these pillars of European stability. If the Ottoman Empire could be partitioned, then by extension so can Austria-Hungary, and so can the Russian Empire, making it far more, again, vulnerable to a more ethnically consolidated state like Germany. So the more, again, is to emphasize is that all these conservative pillars of repressing nationalism, which help the alliance basically consolidate during the era of Metternich, actually means you can say that Bismarck's fall and you can say the antipathy towards Russia and Germany actually falls from a sort of similar policy, which is a failure to appreciate nationalism, and in many ways both cases being sort of overcome and overthrown by nationalism, especially in the case of Wilhelm II and his desire to take on a far more nebulous and ill-fated world course, Weltpolitik, for Germany, with very sort of dubious results. As for, again, how Russia is going to configure its new identity, it results in the the Russo-French alliance of 1894, which again really forms the bedrock of the alliance system that we see in the First World War. The reason, again, this is significant is the question of why. Why would Russia form an alliance with France, which was Germany's greatest enemy? Again, just to reference this for people who don't understand, German unification came about as a result of the Franco-Prussian War in terms of the final act. The Franco-Prussian War had seen the complete and utter defeat of France, the destruction of the Second French Empire, and the occupation of Paris, and the proclamation of the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles in 1871. Alsace and Lorraine had been annexed to Germany as a course of the war, the new German Empire. And the French Third Republic, when it was basically consolidated by the 1880s, it was able to, in many ways, form some form of stable identity around the vilification of Germany. This is where you have strange figures like General Boulanger and his sort of French militaristic patriotism, the prospect again of having a new Caesarist or Napoleonic government in France is going to lead a war against Germany. From the beginning, you can say Russia is looking at the events in France and it's not looking at it, very ideologically in terms of looking at France as this great republican power and Germany as this great sort of reactionary throwback. Rather, it's looking at France and saying, well, if Germany is so worried about France, then we can use this to our advantage. We can pit the French and the Germans against each other, and we can use that conflict basically to win concessions elsewhere. One of the concessions that Bismarck was desperate to achieve from the Russians was a Russian guarantee of Alsace and Lorraine, because that would have meant Russia accepting the border situation, which would have essentially meant that any alliance between Russia and France was impossible, because the French would not concede that issue under any circumstances. It would have been deaf to any government to concede that point fully. So the Russians never concede to that. And in that case, you can say that's Bismarck's greatest defeat. If there was to be a triumph for the Dreikaiserbund, the Three Emperors League, his alliance with Russia, it would have been through the Russian acceptance and protection of Germany's possessions in Alsace-Lorraine, which it never achieved. So as Bismarck fell, and as Wilhelm was pursuing a more pro-English course, England and France were virtually hostile at this period in time. They were competing over the scramble of Africa. In 1898, a few years after this period, that will result in the Fashoda crisis. Basically, whether it be in Egypt, which had been occupied by Britain to much great French consternation, whether it be in West Africa, or whether it be in Siam, in Indochina, there were many, many flashpoints between the French and the British, and this has been going on for decades now, especially after the relationship between France and Britain had been cooled after the fall of the Second French Empire and Napoleon III. And so the prospect that was emerging is that there would be an alliance between Austria, Italy, Germany, and also Britain, and by extension, the Ottoman Empire. This, as far as Alexander III was concerned, and as far as Gears, as you can see on this map, was concerned, was what the Russians were essentially reacting to. The only alliance that essentially could have given Russia some stability in the situation against this five alliance pact between Turkey, Italy, Austria, Germany, and Britain would have been France. France was the only power who could have threatened, again, British influence elsewhere in the world. But France was the only power, again, which had a considerable investment and financial hold over Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, and so could prevent it again joining in an alliance against Russia. So from that point of view, from the point of view of Alexander III, it made a great deal of sense to appeal to France as a natural ally. But of course, the implication is that even if Russia did not see it as explicitly anti-German, but rather it was seen as explicitly anti-Turkish and by extension anti-English, the implication is that the French would obviously see it as anti-German, and it would become the bedrock, you can say, of France's attempts at trying to contrive a conflict in the future, and the prospect that we ultimately see in the First World War, which is an anti-German coalition. So yes, you can say Alexander was taking a completely realpolitik. He wasn't letting dynastic considerations or the legacy of the Holy Alliance or any of these matters into consideration. He was purely thinking about Russian foreign policy interests. But ideologically and in terms of the ramifications going forward, again, one of the most significant events of the 19th century.
Yeah, it's also noteworthy that it kind of brings France out of their kind of isolation and situation of containment that had been successfully imposed on them. For one thing, I believe they'd been fairly successfully portrayed as a kind of ideological outsider compared to, and that, I should say, one of the things that did unite the Dreikaiserbund was that's kind of sense of ideological camaraderie, and that's potentially one thing that Russia is sort of getting out of it, in the same way that they thought that they were basically just trying to uphold the Holy Alliance settlement in the Crimean War, but yeah, as part of the alliance with France, they were able to bring France out of that kind of isolation. I think one of the things that ended up being a stipulation, or at least a result, was there had been, it might have been in the authorized Russian Orthodox prayers, like the official prayers, I believe included a condemnation of the French, particularly because of their Republican leanings. And
well,
so
just to recall for the audience that orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality was explicitly a statement against France and Republican identity and the whole basis of French nationality, liberty, equality, fraternity.
Oh yeah, definitely. And that was the subtext, as I was saying earlier, in terms of providing a combative ideological grounding or foundation. But not only is there the subtext, there is also the text, in that it was explicitly within the statement that had to be read, that there was an explicit condemnation of France and the French government, and that was removed, obviously.
I mean, in terms of this sort of complete ideological about-face, it's very Nixon in China, isn't it? In terms of reaching out to an implacable sort of ideological enemy in order to form a new front against the true enemy, which of course in this case, in that case was the Soviet Union, but in this case would be Germany.
It's a good comparison, yeah.
So yes, it's very difficult to conceive it other than you can say a reactive gambit from the point of view of Alexander III. There wasn't this sort of premeditated desire, as is often presented, to curb German expansionism. Really, if we're looking at Kaiser Wilhelm II at this point, we're simply talking about the inklings of expansionism. However, this is going to be ill-fated for Germany, because whilst Germany will eventually get its Ottoman alliance, which the Russians feared, the Germans would not get the alliance they really needed, which is the alliance with Britain. They'd attempt to do so. In fact, Rosebery, it should be mentioned, the British Liberal Prime Minister from 1894 to 1896, attempts this and fails to achieve this. There was also an attempt by figures like Arthur Balfour and Edward VII to achieve a similar policy, and once again it failed. And by the time we have the naval arms race, the Tirpitz Plan, and the Entente, the prospect of a serious prospect between a Anglo-German alliance is effectively dead, which results in interesting episodes like the Daily Telegraph affair in 1908. So the Russians were able to gain a French alliance and vice versa, but the Germans were not able to gain an English alliance out of this. I think what this is indicating a tendency, actually, is that, as we're going to see, Germany had been created by a genius statesman who was able to ensure that there wasn't an anti-German coalition presented against him. But I would almost say here that the French and the Russians will prove themselves to be far more adroit in terms of politicking, in terms of creating the coalition that will emerge in the First World War.
One other thing I was going to add, I've kind of alluded to it a little bit, and possibly a contributing factor in all of this is during the, I believe it was the 1890s, there was a push Apparently, they called the Scramble for Concessions, though I've not heard it before under that name in China. Basically, the war for influence over China, and up to that point, due to the various opium wars, the British had been able to gather for themselves a number of economic concessions in China. So effectively, they had a sort of economic monopoly of sorts. Monopoly is going too far, but they had a very, very advantageous position in China, in Chinese markets. And Russia and Germany were broadly on the same page in terms of trying to push the idea of breaking up China into spheres of influence instead. Unsuccessfully, as it turns out, of course, although that kind of policy never goes away, except it takes more of a subterfuge form, especially in the warlords era. But anyway, although that push was obviously defeated by Britain and I believe to a lesser extent America, that probably drove some level of animosity between Germany and Britain, because Germany and Russia were two of the main powers who were essentially pushing for this, especially pushing for it the hardest because they had the most to gain from it.
In 1894, of course, it's the year of the Russo-Japanese alliance, but it's also the year that Alexander III died. He died prematurely. He was only 49. He was expected to last much longer. He was a very physically virile and strong man, but he'd suffered an accident as a result of a train crash, and it basically came back to him, and he died in 1894. So Alexander's son, Nicholas II, who had very little practical experience, had not been given really any preparation to rule, became Tsar. And this is a brief summary given by Christopher Clark, the author of Sleepwalkers, and this is in Sleepwalkers, as to Nicholas and his attitude, you can say, to foreign policy and his relationship towards his foreign ministers and his governments going forward. Even within the highly authoritarian setting of the Russian autocracy, the influence of the Tsar over foreign policy was subject to narrow constraints and waxed and waned. Like George V, who had become King of England, King of Great Britain and Ireland in 1910, the new Tsar was a blank sheet of paper when he came to the throne in 1894. He had not created a political network of his own before the Ascension, and his deference to his father, that he refrained from expressing a view on government policy. As an adolescent, he had shown little aptitude for the study of affairs of state. Konstantin Papadonotsev, the conservative jurist, drafted it to give teenage Nicky a masterclass in the inner workings of the Tsarist state. Later recalled, I could only observe that he was completely absorbed in picking his nose. Even after he had mounted the throne, extreme shyness and terror at the prospect of having to wield real authority prevented him in the early years from imposing his political preferences insofar as he had them on the government. He lacked, moreover, a kind of executive support he would have needed to shape policy in a constant way. He possessed, for example, no strict secretariat and no personal secretary. He could and did insist on being informed on even quite minor ministerial decisions. But in a state as vast as Russia, this merely meant that the monarch was engulfed in trivia while matters of real import fell by the wayside. The Tsar was nonetheless able, especially from around the year 1900, to impart a certain direction to Russian foreign policy. By the late 1890s, Russia was deeply involved in the economic penetration of China. Not everyone in the administration was happy with this Far Eastern policy. Some resented the immense cost of infrastructure and material commitments involved. Others, such as the Minister for War, General Alexei Kuropatkin, viewed the Far East as a distraction from more pressing concerns on the Western periphery, especially the Balkans and the Turkish Straits. But at the time, Nicholas II still firmly believed that the future of Russia lay in Siberia and the Far East, and ensured that the exponents of Eastern policy prevailed over their opponents. Despite some initial misgivings, he supported the policy of seizing the Chinese bridgehead at Port Arthur on the Liaodong Peninsula in 1898. In Korea, Nicholas came to support a policy of Russian penetration that placed St. Petersburg on a coalition course with Tokyo. Nicholas's interventions took the form of informal alignments rather than executive decisions. He was closely associated, for example, with aristocratic entrepreneurs who ran the Yellow River timber concessions in Korea. The Yellow timber magnate, Bezobrazov, a former officer of the elite Chevalier Guard, used his personal connections with the Tsar to establish the Yellow as a platform for extending Russian informal empire into the Korean peninsula. In 1901, the finance minister, Sergei Witte, who would later become the first technical prime minister of Russia following the revolution of 1905, reported that Bezobrazov was with the Tsar no less than 2 times a week, 4 hours at a time, advising him on Far Eastern policy. Ministers were exasperated by the presence at court of these influential outsiders, but there was little they could do to curb their influence. These informal links in turn drew the Tsar into an ever more aggressive vision of Russian policy in the region. I do not want to seize Korea, Nicholas told Prince Henry of Prussia in 1901, but under no circumstances can I allow Japan to become fully established there. That would be a cause for war. Nicholas further tightened his control over policy by appointing a viceroy of East Asia with full responsibility not only for civil and military matters, but also for relationships with Tokyo. The holder of this office, one Admiral Alexeyev, was subject directly to the Tsar and thus immune from any ministerial supervision. The appointment had been engineered by a clique around Bezobrazov, who saw it as a means of bypassing the relatively cautious Far Eastern policy of the Foreign Ministry. As a consequence, Russia operated what was in effect 2 parallel official and non-official imperial policies, enabling Nicholas II to pick between options and play the factions off against each other. Admiral Alexeyev had no experience or understanding of diplomacy and exhibited abrasive and intransigence in style that was bound to alienate and anger his Japanese interlocutors. Whether Nicholas II ever consciously adopted a policy of war with Japan is doubtful, but he certainly carried the lion's share of responsibility for the war that broke out in 1904, and thus also for the disaster that followed. Just in terms of referencing the informal influence, one of these informal influences was none other than the French faith healer Philippe, who had been part of the impetus behind the canonization of Saint Seraphim, who I reference on my Rasputin stream as basically a proto-Rasputin. And he is significant again for perhaps again trying to appeal to the Tsar's interests in the region of saying that again the Tsar will rule in the East. So there was that also spiritual connection which was exhibited through Alexandra and linked again with the birth of the Tsarevich Alexei in 1904. But another element which is being drawn here is not just the Tsar in terms of trying to direct foreign policy towards the East in particular, the fact that he shows, you can say, incompetence in terms of being able to deal with certain officials and delegate that authority, the fact that he's basically willing to involve himself, frustrate and play off factions against each other to ensure that there is no overarching minister of which essentially he shows deference to, like a Bismarck case in Wilhelm I. But the fact that he will achieve this policy and fail dramatically, he will bungle this policy. The emphasis again that he may, say for example, have not desired war in 1904 with Japan, but he basically created the conditions which meant that Russia blundered into war all the same. The reason I mention this again is that I believe that history will repeat itself in some form when we come to 1914. That's again not a novel view, it's a view again that Christopher Clark will also express. Indeed, my view, which I expressed in terms of my Russia's Greatest Defeat video, is that strategically, Nicholas was completely sound in terms of his Manchurian campaign and indeed his Korean strategy as well, in terms of also establishing the Russian presence in Port Arthur. The issue was in creating an atmosphere with the Japanese that convinced the Japanese, perhaps correctly, that the Russians would not just conquer Manchuria, but they had intentions basically on preventing the Japanese creating a protectorate over Korea, which they very much saw after 1894, 1895 as part of their own sphere of influence. And so this would give them every cause and justification towards war. If the Tsar essentially believed he could prevaricate and play for time, he didn't do so successfully, and thereby created the response that led to the sinking of the Pacific Squadron in 1904. So yes, as a sort of brief introduction to the Tsar's policy and linking back to your comments about the centrality of China in terms of, you can say, forming part of this diplomatic sort of tragedy of comedy of errors that we see.
Yes, I definitely agree with your assessment on the strategic posture of the war, but and the series of decisions that went into it. But I'd probably go further, and I guess this is where I might come off as a Nicholas apologist. But some of it, so much of it, seems like looking for sources for the outcome, like far in advance. When I look at all these individual decisions and these individual inputs that Nicholas made, and regardless of what is said about his personality and his way of conducting himself interpersonally, it does seem like he, by and large, came to mostly correct conclusions. I think the tendency, even now, is for Russia to derive quite a lot of its strength from Siberia, and although they didn't know at the time the full extent of advantage that could be gained from Siberia in terms of resources, there's been very much a vindication there. And even if you were just looking at it in terms of farmland and the ability to sort of like create something new, so you could look at it from the perspective of the Stolypin reforms, looking ahead a little bit in terms of trying to reform Russian agriculture. The places where that model is practiced by far the most successfully is in Siberia, and those places, incidentally, end up being much greater supporters of anti-Bolshevik movements in general, really. And then obviously in Manchuria as well, there's a great deal of advantage to be gained, although they were only just skimming at the surface of what opportunities that area provided. I think the strategy in terms of how to increase their position was also broadly correct, even before the war, in that they were pursuing what I like to call a kind of kick the dog strategy, where they just kept building up their power and kind of presenting small provocations that could be turned into something larger, but that would gradually strengthen Russia's position until Japan was essentially in no position to be able to resist anymore, and thus they would have to, the kicking the dog analogy is either the dog bites and is put down, or they continue to be kicked until they die. So obviously in this case, Japan chose the bite back option, and they did so in many ways against all odds successfully, because the strategy that they opt to pursue is one that is proven to be very difficult to maintain and extremely costly and often unsuccessful in wars both previously and subsequently, in terms of trying to fight a much superior enemy just with basically relentless aggression and trying to keep up the tempo of warfare, as well as also being able to enjoy the fantastic luck of killing Russia's most able admiral pretty much in the surprise attack, I believe, or at least very shortly afterwards. I can't remember the exact timeline on that, but the admiral in charge of the Pacific Fleet at the time. Sorry, go on.
Well, no, just we're more or less sort of completely in agreement, and again, that was my central thesis regarding, you can say, the natural sort of strategic impetus towards the east, but of course the Tsar completely bungled it, and he was able to basically alienate all the factions in the region, and also essentially create the conditions for the the Anglo-Japanese alliance at the same time, that basically neutered the French from coming to Russia's aid at the same time. So yes, he may have been correct in terms of a broad sort of strategic impetus, but in terms of his way of actually achieving it, he expanded too quickly without having established the necessary infrastructure. The Siberian Railway, again, was still relatively primitive, and Japan, the Russians have been fully aware of what's been going on in Japan since the Treaty of Shimonoseki in the 1860s. And of course, Nicholas had actually been to Japan, and there was even an assassination attempt against Nicholas there. So he was very aware of everything that was going on in terms of the developments in the East. But still, he managed to bungle the situation. In terms of, again, bringing this up...
Just quickly, he also had the assurances from Germany of German interference if ever it became a problem, and obviously that came to nothing as well.
Yes, I know, but I'll get to that point. Part of that, again, is the fact that the Germans essentially would have had to have operated under a position of quid pro quo, and this comes the issue of Lambsdorff. Clark was referencing the fact that the foreign offers had basically been circumvented in the situation, and the foreign minister was none other than Lambsdorff. And this also sort of comes back to the Bjorko situation. not only was Lambsdorff again opposed to more or less again the grandiose aspects of this strategy in the East, which had been pursued by the Tsar, but he was also the one to completely and utterly dress down the Tsar at the Bjorka conference. This was at the height of the infamous Willy Nicky correspondence between the two rulers. They met at a conference in Sweden, and it was at this conference where they agreed on, again, the basis of bypassing ministerial appointments and conducting informal diplomacy of the like, again, which Bismarck basically conducted the Dreikaiserbund, that they would form an alliance, because essentially the French had failed to manifest any sort of real support towards the Russians in the war. And what did Lambsdorff do in response? He basically dressed down the Tsar and said, "You must forget it ever happened." Lambsdorff eventually was removed, but you can say for actually unrelated reasons, more to do with the role of Stolypin and Sergei Witter within the subsequent Russian Revolution. But all this again is to say that the Tsar would routinely again have to face off these ministers and play them against each other. And as a result, there would be many schizophrenic elements in terms of Russian foreign policy. I don't believe there's any situation where he could have seriously, again, leaned on the idea of German support, because that would, as Lambsdorff was basically telling him, cause the French to basically depart from the situation of the alliance. So yes, in terms of arriving at the situation, it comes to the central question again of coming back to the idea of the Tsar saint, is that Nicholas again was in many ways responsible for the conditions for this calamity. And I believe, yes, by extension, he also sort of shares a great sort of deal of the blame in terms of precipitating the conflict, even though he did not intend it. So that is just the adage that we have regarding Nicholas, as the contrast between the quote unquote passion bearer and the witness to Christ, and these incredibly grandiose policies of expansionism that would again be far more in keeping with Catherine the Great or Peter II. If you look at a conservative figure like Nicholas I, I don't see anything quite as grandiose in terms of these aspirations. I mean, maybe going back to Alexander I and his wars in the Caucasus, his annexation of Poland. Alexander I, like Nicholas II, again comes off as one of these incredibly schizophrenic figures who, in many ways, blunders into conflicts and switches alliances. And I think perhaps again there's some merit in seeing some sort of continuity between figures like Alexander II and Nicholas I, and Alexander I and Nicholas II. That especially in terms of their alliance, their allusions towards constitutionalism, because as a result of this conflict, there is of course a revolution, and Nicholas is forced to concede the creation of a Duma, a Russian parliament for the first time, that really stymies the autocracy. And as we'll see, as with his evasion of any sort of ministerial sort of overreach in terms of his overweening authority as autocrat, he will spend the remainder of his reign trying to undo, you can say, the effects of the Russian Revolution of 1905, 1906. And again, I wouldn't say irony, but the predictable effects of that is that that's itself a cause of the Russian Revolution of 1917. So just with that in mind, I'm going to finish off this segment by Christopher Clark, and then we'll move forward. On the eve of the Russo-Japanese War, one could say that the Tsar's influence was up, while the minister's was down. But the state of affairs was short-lived, because the catastrophic outcome of the Tsar's policy sharply diminished his ability to set the agenda, i.e. the total and utter defeat. As the news of successive defeats sank in and social unrest engulfed Russia, a group of ministers led by Sergei Witter pushed through reforms designed to unify the government. By unify the government, or basically to establish a united executive, which would be more or less accountable to the Tsar, but in many ways ostracize him from power, isolate him rather. Power was concentrated in a council of ministers, headed for the first time by a chairman or prime minister. Under Witter, and his successor Stolypin, the executive was shielded to some extent by arbitrary interventions by the monarch. Stolypin, in particular, a man of immense determination, intelligence, charisma, and tireless industry, managed to assert his personal authority over most of the ministers, achieving a level of coherence in government that had been mostly unknown before 1905. During the Stolypin years, Nicholas seemingly curiously absent from political activity. The Tsar did not acquiesce for long in this arrangement. Even while Stolypin was in power, Nicholas found ways of circumventing his control by making deals with individual ministers behind the Premier's back. Among them was Foreign Minister Izvolsky, whose mishandling of negotiations with Austria-Hungary and his counterpart Aehrenthal triggered the Bosnian crisis of 1908. In return for Vienna's diplomatic support over Russian access to the Turkish Straits, Izvolsky approved the Austrian annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina. Neither Prime Minister Stolypin nor his ministerial colleagues had been informed about this daring enterprise, which was clearly directed by the Tsar himself. By the time Stolypin's assassination by terrorists in the autumn of 1911, Nicholas was systematically undercutting his authority by supporting his political opponents. Again, the irony here, of course, is that had Stolypin presented himself as a Bismarck-type figure, the rumors about his assassination is that on the one hand, he was assassinated by someone who had socialist or liberal sympathies, but on the other, he was assassinated actually by a sympathizer of the autocracy and conservative elements within the Romanov family that did not appreciate the fact that Stolypin was prepared to consolidate affairs under a non-Romanov and non-royalist-led civilian government. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. I mean, it comes up with Rasputin as well. That angle of the Romanov ultras, as it were. But I would also like to add, it would be remiss of me, given so much that I've said about it in the past, to not point out how much of the 1905 revolution was an inorganic process that was produced by Motojiro Akashi as an agent of Japanese interests for the direct furtherance of the war, which, yeah, to a great extent, the various factions that were assembled to carry out the revolution under Japanese funding, essentially, and to some extent organization. Obviously, his internal police should have been on top of that, but as it happened, they were, and it just meant that there was some amount of rerouting of troops in order to quell it more fully. But all of the ringleaders, generally speaking, were rounded up pretty quickly, and then it was just a case of putting out the fire. So perhaps a mishandling of the specifics, but in the broad strokes, it seems to me that it was handled broadly correctly.
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm not going to go that far in terms of conceding there was no sort of organic element to the 1904 and 1905 revolution. I mean, just talk about the police element alone. The issue with I forget the exact interior minister at that time, but the unions and much of the political parties have been completely and utterly infiltrated by police informants, and terrorist acts were more or less not approved by the state, but they were tolerated by the state in order to ostracize certain radical political movements from, you can say, middle-class bourgeois approval, which created a situation essentially where many of the industrialists and financiers and bourgeoisie in Moscow and St. Petersburg in particular aligned themselves to the Tsar for the sake of political security. One of the elements, of course, of this is that one of these informants, Father Gapon, took it upon himself to lead a petition to the Winter Palace. And you can say that the massacre that ensued was a result of a series of communication breakdowns and incompetence in all parts of the organizations of Russia and the Tsar himself and Alexandria in terms of their culpability for it. But to say again that this is the result of foreign interventionism, again, I think is quite a stretch. I think, as with the causes for the Russo-Japanese War in particular, I think you can pin a lot of the causes for the 1905 revolution down to ministerial incompetence.
I would, yeah, of course, the events with Gapon are indicative of a complicated series of plates being spinned, some of which end up falling. So particularly, he was an acolyte of Sergei Zupatov, Although, once again, that's proved to have been a broadly correct strategy, because it's been subsequently used even by Russia themselves and the Soviets themselves since then, and intelligence agencies worldwide. It's just, Gapon went rogue in that one case. But yeah, I think I feel very confident saying that quite a significant portion of all of those events are down to Mutajiro Akashi in particular, and the Japanese government seems to have treated it as such. I think the quote is something like that he was worth an additional 8 divisions.
No, I'm sure, of course, and this is well documented in terms of all of the not just in terms of the Japanese elements, but the certain Jewish elements again that were supporting the revolution for more or less the same causes, in terms of the Tsar's approach to pogroms and Kishinev in particular. I don't want to sort of take this conversation down too much of a track. The main argument again is to emphasize that the Tsar consistently throughout his reign in terms of foreign policy would assume again the necessity of the autocracy in all of these affairs. And so if we see the emergence of a figure from which again foreign policy and domestic policy in general could be delegated to some form of civilian government, essentially, it's always more or less on moored in the figure like Stolypin. The Tsar essentially again would appeal to figures like Izvolsky, and in the case of Lambsdorff with the Russo-Japanese War, again appeal to figures like Bezobrazov, and the interior minister, I forgot his name, was von Plever, in terms of this idea of police socialism and acquiescing, you could say, to a little aspect of state-sponsored terrorism and things like that. All of these elements would, as well as the support of Rachkovsky as a head of St. Petersburg police later on during the revolutions, indicate that the Tsar was simultaneously appealing to the archetype of, the Christian ruler, appealing to his subjects more broadly, and using that as basically a means of rallying the Black Hundreds and the land captains and the mayors, etc. Yet at the same time, supporting sort of state sort of directed terrorism indirectly. I mean, you just have to take all of these elements and understand that Nicholas II was a figure sort of mired in these contradictions, of which basically this stream is a testament to. Confronted with them, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say. I mean, with all of these complicated, I won't call it schemes, but policies and directions. I do tend to think that had things not ended how they did, and had the trajectory simply continued, he would probably be considered much more of a genius.
I don't see that policy at all, I'm afraid. And the reason I do is that if you have the exhibition of ultra Tsarism, as you say, in the figure like Rasputin, having just covered a figure like Rasputin, there is obviously, and there was, a consistent conservative argument to be used in defense of Rasputin. Yet at the same time, the police services, again, in the Interior Ministry, that were very much intended in terms of preserving the Tsar's aura and personality, were very much aware of how much of a liability he was, and how the Empress was unwilling essentially to deal with aspects of that liability to the Tsar's authority, and how, when you can say the complete farce of civilian government was demonstrated with the Tsar's again desire to empower Rasputin directly, it resulted in a complete and utter ministerial collapse and collapse in the faith in the Tsar's government. So all this again is to emphasize is that this isn't some sort of radical departure with a figure like Rasputin. You can say Rasputin is actually, you can say, the final form of an aspect of Nicholas's policy of divide and rule going forward. But if it was, again, a policy of divide and rule, it ended in complete and utter farce and catastrophe, involving appointing a syphilitic madman to become interior ministry at a point where the Russian situation was most sensitive. I'll just finish this point before we get to the July crisis. Confronted with a ministerial bloc that threatened to confine Nicholas's freedom of action, Nicholas withdrew support and insinuated against men that he had himself placed in power. Sergei Witte fell victim to this autocratic behavior in 1906. Stolypin would have done so had he not been killed, and his successor, the mild-mannered Vladimir Kukovtsov, the figure you actually see on the bottom right of this image here, was removed from office in February 1914 because he had revealed himself to be a devotee of united government. Kokopsov, by reference, was Stolypin's successor, and he was seen as perhaps the most consistently anti-war figure in the higher echelons of the Russian government. So his removal and deliberate undermining by the Tsar again is seen as one of these major sort of contributing causes for, you can say, the ascendancy of other figures that you see on this image, such as the war minister, Sukhomlinov, Danilov, and by extension, Sazonov, the foreign minister, who, again, ironically, was actually another protege of Stolypin. The autocratic power was not deployed always in support of a consistent policy vision. It was used in a negative way to safeguard the autonomy and power of the monarch by breaking any political formulations that looked as if they might secure an initiative. The consequence of the autocratic intervention was thus not the implication of the Tsar's will as such, but rather a lasting uncertainty about who had power to do what and what state of affairs that flourished and enabled a flourishing of factional strife, which critically undermined the consistency of consistent Russian decision-making. So, yes, I tend to be of the far more conventional historical school in the sense that in echoing all of the passages and the authors that I brought up today, what Tsarism in terms of foreign policy represents is the desire to play with elements of pan-Slavism or popular sentiment or whatever, but eventually quash them should they ever emerge as threatening the Tsar's authority personally. This is the case with Nicholas II, it's the case with Alexander II, it's the case with Alexander III, and it is also the case with Nicholas II. I think it's actually remarkable how in all of these cases the Tsars seem to be considering the same policy, which is Tsarism is paramount. It supersedes any of these more particular policy concerns or indeed these ideologies, especially these ethno-nationalist ideologies that pop up. And that even means that the Tsar has, you can say, it's incumbent upon him to undermine his own civilian officials and his own government, which again is directly accountable to him, not the Duma, let alone any sort of broadly representative group like a British Parliament. But of course, it reaches a series of tragic instances, and it's already been alluded to, but now we have to discuss it, which is the Bosnian crisis of 1908, 1909. Several things to sort of mention before here. My reading of the Russo-Japanese War, in terms of, again, this being a victory for the French and a victory for the British more than anything else, is that by proxy, essentially, the Russians have been defeated on a major sphere of influence to have basically been quashed. Russian influence has been quashed in China. And so Britain, France, and even by extension Germany were able to assume a position of influence, which Russian sort of interests were able to threaten on all fronts. And so Britain was able to conclude a series of negotiations and peace treaties with Russia with regards to the other major flashpoints, Afghanistan and Persia in particular. And as we emerged towards 1914, the Triple Entente would emerge into a more concrete alliance. But as a result of the Russo-Japanese War, this Triple Entente, I would say, was far more deferential towards French and British interests initially than it was to Russian influence. Russia was sort of emerging towards Britain and France in 1907 as more of a supplicant. But you can say again, from the Tsar's point of interest, he was able to secure major concessions in Persia and potential concessions over the Ottoman Empire that would drive Russian interests going forward into the First World War. But now, having essentially been locked out of significant influence in the Far East, we return to the issue of Serbia. Serbia had been considered by Russia to be an Austrian protectorate, and yet in 1903 there was the quote-unquote May coup, a very dramatic event that involved the assassination of the king of Serbia, Alexander, by a group of pan-Slavist ultranationalists called the Black Hand, who would later assume basically a shadow rule in Serbia, influencing much of the direction of the country going forward, inhabiting significant roles in the interior ministry, and basically being in many ways the power behind the new dynasty under King Peter. This meant that essentially it wasn't just Bulgaria that could be used as a vehicle for pan-Slavism within the Balkans, but also Serbia. And this, you can say, was very useful to the Russians because the Bulgarian situation in 20 years earlier, in 1886, had proven that the Bulgarians could not be relied on to be willing puppets, essentially, of the Russians. And so this revolves around the Bosnian crisis. As is already stated, the Bosnian crisis was in many ways the creation of Foreign Minister Izvolsky. His focus was on achieving Russian access to the Straits, Constantinople and Gallipoli. The Austrians were wanting to annex Bosnia-Herzegovina, a region they had occupied since the original Balkan crisis some 30 years before. Essentially, Izvolsky believed that gaining Austrian acquiescence and support over the Straits would mean German support over access and occupation of the Straits. And in return, Russia would basically be conceding nothing, which is the loss of a territory that had already been under Austrian occupation for 30 years. And again, if the Tsar is to be looked at a positive light in terms of supporting Izvolsky here, I believe that there is a logic behind it, but there is also a logic to believe that Izvolsky effectively duped the Tsar into this scheme, and that Izvolsky believed wrongly that if the Austrians, and by extension the Germans, supported Russian opening up of the Straits, that the British and the French, their quote-unquote new allies through the Triple Entente, would also be persuaded to support this agreement. What Izvolsky had failed to realize is that the Triple Entente, again, was an alliance made by a supplicant Russia, not an ascendant Russia, which is my contention, and that the French and the British would never support the opening of the Russian Straits. In fact, in terms of, you can say, British animosity directed towards Russia and in support of Turkey, the British were actually building dreadnoughts which were going to be sold off to the Ottoman Empire as late as 1914. The British had not completely abandoned all prospects of forming an alliance with the Ottoman Empire. They had even, again, been with the coup against Abdul Hamid in 1908 and the ascendancy of the Young Turks. The Young Turks effectively prevaricated towards their more established position of being pro-German and reaching out to form a French and British alliance. So it was actually a brief possibility in 1908 that we could have seen a Russo-Ottoman, Franco-English alliance. But alas, that didn't come to pass. The regime was far too fragile. We have the Balkan Wars, we have the coup of the three pashas under Enver Pasha, and what would later be the definitive turn of the Ottoman Empire towards Germany in declaring war against Russia later in 1914. The reason, again, I bring this up is that from the point of view, again, of Russia, this had begun as a gambit to win access to the Straits and increase Russian influence over the declining Ottoman Empire. Izvolsky had badly gambled, again, in this situation due to his misreading of the situation. But after the gamble failed, Russia recontextualized this situation as fixating on Serb designs, Serb irredentism of acquiring Bosnia-Herzegovina, placing this basically as a question of the alliance between Serbia and Russia, and seeing that Austria was basically, in many ways, indirectly attacking Serbia, as preposterous as that would seem. And in terms of a victimhood narrative around Serbia, in terms of an attack on personal and international prestige, it is basically seen as a forerunner for the ultimatum that we see towards Serbia in 1914, in terms of having many of the same hallmarks. Again, as you can probably tell based on my argumentation, this was very much, you can say, a post hoc justification by Izvolsky to save some face after having so drastically miscalculated the situation. But the lasting effects were severe in terms of the results of war a few years later. Aehrenthal and Izvolsky had attempted an entente, an attempt to restore relations between Austria and Russia. And because Izvolsky had failed in his gambit towards the Straits, Izvolsky basically pulled the rug out of that entente. And more or less after that, we have Russian posture towards the complete dismantling of Austria-Hungary becoming adopted more into the mainstream discourse thereafter, where previously that hadn't really been on the cards. There had been the idea, a nebulous idea of influencing or having a control over East Galicia, but the full dismantling of Austria-Hungary really only became a serious policy consideration of the Russians after 1909. So from what basically arose over trivial causes and a grandiose aspiration by a more or less rogue foreign minister, actually had vast and lasting consequences, especially over a relatively trivial issue. about phantom gains of the Serbs in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the question of Russia's national prestige in the region.
Yeah, no disagreements. And part of the reason I wanted to focus on Asia so much leading into this is because, yeah, as you're saying, well, as you sort of added to the preamble of all this, Russia has been basically blocked out of Asia. Central Asia has been, well, East Asia, I should say. Central Asia has been, already more or less completely partitioned. There's nothing else to do there, and thus the only area left to try to gain some kind of international prestige or standing, and maybe even for domestic consumption, is essentially the Balkans / Europe. So yeah, it puts a microscope on anything that happens there, and inflames tensions whenever there is even relatively minor disagreements.
Yes, exactly. The effects of the Triple Entente, from my point of view, have always been that it enabled Britain to win the Great Game. It won the Great Game in East Asia. It wins the Great Game in Central Asia, being that Russia was really in no position ever to attack India. And it was also in no position really to threaten the newly discovered Persian Gulf oil fields either. Russia was able to take over the North Caspian routes and Azerbaijan, but more or less the economically vital strategic interests were held by Britain, as is basically the case with France as well. Britain was able to manipulate all of these colonial crises basically to ensure that they had the more economically viable territories, which was consistent with their interests. And so Russia, as a supplicant in the Triple Alliance, was basically forced into these. Really, the Bosnian question in terms of Russian national interests is a non-question. Izvolsky recognized that Russia's interests focus on the centrality of the Straits, and he was completely frustrated in that gambit. And I think moving forward into the Balkan Wars, the Straits issue, again, is one that assumes absolute paramountcy. So I have an image on the bottom here, which is of Ev Krivoshin, the agricultural minister, and considered to be one of the most powerful figures within the civilian government of Russia in the lead up to the First World War. The reason he was so significant, again, he was advocating for this policy directed, like Izvolsky, towards the securing of Russian interests in the Straits. Because of, you can say, the wealth of Ukraine and Russian exports, Russia had become an increasingly powerful export economy throughout the 1880s and 1890s. Russian industrialization was relatively meager. It was, it was continuing in full earnest really since Alexander III, but it was localized around several core cities like Kiev and Kharkov, St. Petersburg and Moscow. And as relations with Germany and Austria-Hungary were worsening, especially after 1912, the issue of the Straits became more paramount because in the event of war, Russia would lose most of its overland routes in terms of being able to export goods to the rest of the world. And so when we have the Balkan Wars, the questions don't really focus on the issue of, Serb expansion or irredentism or whatever, which, as I've already alluded to, seem to be far more nebulous, but instead focused on the paramount economic, strategic, and in terms of Russian messianism, the imperative of taking over Second Rome, of taking over Constantinople or Zagreb, the city of the Tsars, which is why when you have 1912 and the series of the Balkan Wars that unravel, Russia occupies a very strange place in it. For reference, in 1911, the Italians go to war with the Ottoman Empire over Libya, and they end up taking Libya and the Dodecanese. The weakness of the Ottoman Empire in terms of holding up its colonial empire basically demonstrates to the Montenegrins, funnily enough, one of the smallest and most insignificant of the Balkan powers to declare war. The Montenegrins are soon followed up by the Serbians and the Bulgarians, and they do so successfully that they're able, as you can see on this map here, to, along with the Greeks, more or less evict the Ottoman Empire from Europe entirely, including Constantinople. This creates a crisis in Russia, not because, again, the Ottoman Empire is, collapsing necessarily, but because Bulgaria, of all countries, could potentially take over the Straits. Ferdinand had declared himself Tsar of Bulgaria a few years before. I think it was in 1908, 1909. I've already alluded to this grandiose idea of Bulgaria assuming its medieval identity and perhaps securing Constantinople for itself. And as Bulgaria is not a Russian ally by any means at this point anymore, a Russian satellite, taking over Constantinople effectively would mean not Russian access to the Straits, but Russia having to deal with another great Orthodox Slavonic power. And also in terms of Russia's own prestige and power, having Bulgaria take over Constantinople would effectively frustrate much of Russia's own self-image as the leading Orthodox power. And so there were plans drawn up in Odessa among the Admiralty and the creation, essentially, the new creation of a Black Sea fleet to go to war with Bulgaria over this issue or preemptively seize control of the Straits. As it turns out, those fears were more or less unfounded. The Bulgarians were able to take over Edirne, Adrianople, but they failed to take over Constantinople. And in the third of the Balkan Wars, the first one being the Italian War, the second one being the coalition war against the Turks, the Bulgarians find themselves the victims of a coalition by all the surrounding powers, including Romania, and they lose many of the territories and concessions here. But again, Russia playing a more complicated game doesn't come to the fore in terms of supporting Serbia in this conflict either, nor does Austria get involved in this conflict. Rather, you can say the interests of Austria and in Russia are in preventing Serbia becoming too powerful. This isn't a Ignatieff situation that we saw with the Treaty of San Stefano. Neither power wants any of these quote-unquote Balkan countries, whether it be Serbia or whether it be Bulgaria, becoming too powerful at the expense of any of the other powers. You know, the situation is so sort of mired in complexity and contradiction that to simply see Russia and Serbia as joined at the hip and Serbia's interest is following Russia's is completely obscene, really, in the situation. But nevertheless, again, that's the narrative that we've inherited, especially from the assassination and the July crisis going forward. What emerges during the Balkan Wars, however, is the idea pursued by the Minister of War, Sukhomlinov, that Russia could have pursued a partial mobilization against Austria-Hungary should Austria have decided to get involved in the war to support any of these factions. It was shot down by the Prime Minister at the time, Kokovotsev, but nevertheless, that was the first idea. This partial mobilization theory that would later be pioneered by Sazonov was seriously suggested. This is also, again, as I mentioned, this last sort of brief time that we see a detente between Germany and Russia. And what really ends the detente and further again solidifies the hostility of Russia towards the Ottoman Empire and their desire again to control the Straits is not only the coup of the three pashas, Enver Pasha and the German alliance, but of the quote-unquote Lehmann von Sanders affair, where a German brigadier was placed in control of building up the fortifications around Constantinople and training the new modernized Ottoman army. To resolve this crisis, Lehmann von Sanders was removed from the German army and made part of the Ottoman army as basically an act of saving face. But nevertheless, it confirmed the alliance pretty much between the Ottomans and the Germans. What the Russians had feared happening in 1890, what had been part of the motivation for the original Russo-French alliance in 1894, had come to pass. And again, Russia was now potentially going to be isolated from the region of the Balkans. Bulgaria was drifting towards Austria and Germany. It would form part of the Central Alliance in 1915. Greece was neutral. The only countries you can say that were more or less Russia aligned, and also Romania was now in an alliance with Austria-Hungary and Germany. The only countries that were seen as pro-Russia were Serbia and Montenegro. And so looking at this whole situation, you can basically see that Russia has been kicked out of all of these specific spheres of influence. It has these clearly expansionist aims. I mean, we only need to look at the Russo-Japanese War to see that Nicholas I believed that Russia should pursue a grandiose expansionist aim in China. And now Russia has basically lost out on all of these spheres. It's become a supplicant ally to the French and the British, and now it can potentially lose Serbia and Montenegro within its sphere of influence as well. So really that is just to establish the conditions for the July crisis. Would you have anything to add there, Rupert?
Nothing else, I don't think. No, I think you've covered it pretty well.
So, would you like to give us a quick rundown on the July crisis itself?
Oh, I think you could probably do a much better job than me off the top of my head.
Well, I think the question is in terms of looking at Russia and looking at France. Again, I've already alluded to the German sort of role and part of the fixation on German quote unquote war guilt in this regard, which is the Austria-Hungarian ultimatum. Essentially, Franz Josef, the nephew of Franz Ferdinand, the nephew of Franz Josef, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, is assassinated in Sarajevo at the end of June 1914, 28th of June, the Serb national holiday. And he's done so by an organization known as the Black Hand, which has links with the Serbian government and was responsible for the original assassination of the previous ruling dynasty in Serbia. And so the Austrians very slowly compose a response to the situation in Serbia, more or less, you can say, at the behest of Bethmann Hollweg and the Kaiser, which is to produce the ultimatum. Now, what is fascinating about the situation is basically to say, okay, well, what are German aims in this region? If you're going to sort of believe the Fischer thesis, is that Germany, again, desires to preempt a conflict, inspired by figures like Bethmann Hollweg and von Moltke, the chief of German staff, in order to prevent Russia from consolidating its economy and army successfully, in order to ensure that in any future war, Germany would invariably lose due to Russia's overwhelming economic and demographic potential.
Yeah, I believe the German general staff was of the mind. Well, they specifically gave the year of 1917 as being basically the point of no return at which Germany could never again win a war against Russia. And to my knowledge, that is not really based on anything in particular.
Well, conversely to that, the argument is that Russia and France have been desirous to pursue a war. From the point of view of France, they've been desirous to pursue a war with Germany on favorable terms in a coalition, really ever since 1880. And in terms of Russia, they have been desirous to pursue a war over the Straits and over the Balkans now, in various guises, for over 100 years, but with the breakdown of the Austro-Russian detente under Aehrenthal and Zvolsky, and now the breakdown of the Russo-German detente, and by extension, the fallout following the resignation of Kokoptsov and the Lehman-Sanders affair. All this is to say that if a situation were to present itself whereby Russia and France could present themselves to the world as the victims of a crisis, where they can present Austria and Germany as the aggressors, and most importantly, that they could bring Britain into the course of the war on their side, that would essentially be the great diplomatic triumph. And really, you can say it's a perfect inversion of what Bismarck did in terms of the Franco-Prussian War. For reference, Bismarck was able to contrive a situation with the Spanish succession, whereby a Hohenzollern candidate, a member of the Prussian royal family of Leopold von Sigmaringen, a Catholic Hohenzollern, was presented as a candidate for the Spanish throne, which was really nothing more than a diplomatic gambit in order to induce basically a French response. And through a series of correspondences, basically known as the Elms Dispatch, the French declare war on Prussia. Bismarck is able to basically use this as a way to activate his alliance with all of the other German states and declare this as a patriotic war. And the great success of Germany in that war helps the creation of a unified Germany. So what the Russians and Sazonov and the French have basically realized, that as Germany had won the conflict by feigning to be the injured party and the defensive, that the Serb situation and the Austrian ultimatum, and later the Austrian declaration of war on Serbia in the midst of the July crisis, I believe it was on the 28th of July, 1914, created a perfect situation where Russia could be presented as the victim. And again, the reason why this sort of argument of Russian victimhood, as far as I'm concerned, really falls apart is the partial mobilization on the 25th of July. The Russians were well aware about, and the French were well aware, about the two-pronged strategy in the Schlieffen Plan, and that any prolonged process of Russian mobilization unchecked would essentially mean that Germany would not be able to fight a two-front war against France and Russia simultaneously, unless it were to radically alter its entire strategic calculation. And by that, I mean Germany would have to basically, in a series of few weeks, change all of their chief of staff planning and war footing to be a defensive war with France over Alsace-Lorraine, an aggressive war with Russia, and to focus most of the German units against Russia and not France. Which, if you're going to believe Moltke, the whole planning considerations would take years in order to basically change and mobilize millions of troops in order to face these units. That could not be changed. And so the Russians were exploiting, you could say, the rigidity of Germany's strategic calculus and the Schlieffen Plan in order to exploit a partial mobilization. And what we really mean by a partial mobilization, if you look at this region in Russian Poland, the little salient that sort of pops out in between Germany and Austria-Hungary, it was seen simultaneously as a strategic liability, but in this case as a great strategic asset for the Russians. Partial mobilization in Poland basically meant that the Russians could say that they weren't pursuing full mobilization, yet they were pouring troops into a salient that could essentially occupy East Prussia and East Galicia, the regions which the Russians were most, again, anxious to annex in terms of their immediate security concerns against Germany and Austria-Hungary. If you look at the various fortifications from 20th of July onwards, most of them were put on a war footing. There was martial law declared even in St. Petersburg. So for all intents and purposes, again, it appears that from the 25th of July, the Russians were preparing for war, but the effective demographics and industry and timetables and mobilization in Germany's Schlieffen Plan actually meant that Russia could mobilize without having to declare war and simply allow Germany to be forced into a situation where it would present itself to the world as an aggressor. And I believe that is effectively Sazonov's planning. And in that sense, he was actually completely correct. The great sort of counterpoint to this, in terms of saying that this was all part of ultimately a French-Russian entrapment scheme to force the Germans into a situation where they would present themselves to the world as an aggressor and therefore, assume the culpability for war guilt, are the final elements of the Willie-Nicky correspondence, the telegrams that were sent between the 29th of July and the 1st of August. Between the 28th and the 30th of July, for reference, full mobilization was declared, but there were many countermanding orders being set out to the district commanders where it was unclear whether the partial mobilization was being reversed or the full mobilization of the Russian army was being implemented. This before, it should be mentioned, the declaration of war by Germany on Russia. Indeed, in one of the very telling elements of these telegrams, Nicky corresponded to the Kaiser, "I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me to take extreme measures which will lead to war. To try and avoid such a calamity as a European war, I beg you in the name of our old friendship to do what you can to stop your allies from going too far." This again would be perceived as trying to restrain Serbia, to restrain Austria from going to war with Serbia. A fascinating aspect of this, though, is that it perfectly suited the interests of Russia to enable Austria and Germany to go to war with Serbia, because going to war with Serbia would force the commitment of many more troops against the Serbian front, and Serbia was this very, very militarized nation in the Balkans, which had experience of two recent conflicts and would prove in the course of 1914, 1915 to be very capable of defending itself against a vastly superior force. And so allowing for the attack on Serbia to go ahead would essentially enable the Russians to strengthen their position against East Galicia, while Austria basically weakened its situation by directing forces away from the border with Russia and towards Serbia. So again, the more I sort of look into the situation, the more I see is that delay actually favored the Russian in the situation in terms of being able to bring the full sort of mobilization and strength to bear while the Germans and the Austrians exhausted themselves against these smaller allies, which were basically effectively being the sacrificial offerings for the Russians in this situation, as well as casus belli.
I'm unsure of the extent to which they'd be aware of it, but there was also the element of Austria-Hungary being quite reliant on Balkan grain imports as well, food imports in general. And so during that process of industrialization, they essentially relied on imported grain to keep down food prices. And so it would hamper their ability to wage a long-term war as well, although I don't think anyone was realistically planning for that. So, as I said, I'm not sure it would have figured into planning all that much, but it's a factor.
Well, it's a major factor, and it's a major factor because what is the greatest consideration regarding economic warfare against the Central Powers? Bringing Britain into conflict, because of course Britain, even though we had the naval arms race between Germany and Britain had the ability, projected ability, and was able to demonstrate the ability to maintain a starvation blockade against the Central Powers that, if anything, was the single most significant cause for Entente victory during the war. And this relied on bringing Britain into the conflict. It's one thing to contrive a means, a justification for having Russia and France go to war against Germany and Austria-Hungary, whilst presenting themselves basically as the defensive party, which is, again, a lesson that Bismarck learned and the French and the Russians had learned from Bismarck, and Bethmann-Hollweg was not able to reproduce that same success diplomatically. But the British have been kept out of the loop of this. The ambassador to St. Petersburg, the British ambassador to St. Petersburg, Buchanan, was incredibly incompetent. There's no sort of other way of really expressing it, because he was unaware of the plan to mobilize in Russia until basically he was informed of the full mobilization between the 28th and the 30th. Simultaneously, Edward Grey, the foreign minister of Great Britain, had been pursuing the idea of a conference to settle the dispute during the July crisis following the presentation of the ultimatum on the 24th of July. And what the full mobilization basically did was actually show to Britain that, okay, we're only a couple of days away from war. You need to basically present yourself on one side or the other, and removing essentially the element of time for Britain to intervene and potentially again arrange a diplomatic conference, ensuring essentially that Grey had not a week to deal with the diplomatic repercussions of the ultimatum, but he had to deal with the situation of the mobilization in days. But moreover, because the mobilization had basically preempted the Schlieffen Plan and the invasion of Belgium again gave Britain the casus belli it needed to get involved in the war. So you can look at this indirectly and directly and say that the French and the British, I've often said on my channel that I believe that Edward Grey was the perfect dupe of Paul Cambon, the French ambassador to Britain during this time, in the sense that France and Russia were able to assemble the coalition they needed to effectively achieve the war aims, expansionist war aims of France and Russia. I mean, from Britain's point of view, I've always argued it's relatively inexplicable us getting into World War I for many reasons, partly because many in the Foreign Office wanted a war between Germany and Russia, but not for the reasons of Russia becoming incredibly powerful and having supreme influence over the pan-Slavic sort of movement or over the Straits, but explicitly for the purpose of allowing for the two great continental behemoths to fell each other, to bleed each other white, which was basically in concord with the idea of the Mackinder Plan and the Heartland theory, and that there cannot be a great continental power with the ability to project naval power outwards to threaten the British Empire. But the British had basically achieved that already, if that was their goal, with the declaration of war against Russia on 1st of August 1914. So Britain becoming involved was effectively unnecessary by that point. But you can say that Russia preempting the Schlieffen Plan through the mobilization actually, again, indirectly led to the causes of Britain getting involved in that conflict, ensuring the starvation blockade and what would ultimately prove to be the Entente victory. What the Russians hadn't counted on was the incredible incompetence of the Tsar during this period, which had the Tsar effectively had a more effective and more consistent government during this time, and a more effective home front, then it's very possible that Russia, had it been able to essentially hold its nerve and its morale through 1917, 1918, could have won the war significantly sooner and would have come away with, as you can see here in this very interesting map, this was the original Sykes-Picot Agreement, one that shows the original intentions. We all know about the A to B map, and to a lesser extent the Italian concessions in Antalya, by which essentially the British were given influence over Palestine and Iraq, and the French were given influence over Syria, Lebanon, and the area around Cilicia. But the Russians were given a pervading interest over Armenia, extending up to Trabzon or Trebizond, and of course access and control over the Russian Straits. So had Russia again been able to hold on and stay in the war long enough, it's very possible that she could have achieved the great aim, you can say, that the overall sort of great messianic component of Russian expansionism, which was finally to incorporate Tsargrad. But alas, that was not to be.
Although ironically, that would have put them in more or less the same position as they have with St. Petersburg in the Baltics, in that they just find themselves at a different choke point further into the Mediterranean. But yeah, anyway, I was also going to say we're sort of working with the idea that the long war was either expected or necessary. But I think even prior to that, far more likely the plan, and I would argue the perhaps not logical outcome, but one of the outcomes that was sort of trended towards is the victory of Russia in the very early stages of the war. That is the battles of the Masurian Lakes, because during those battles, Russia was able to essentially present a more numerous and more well-equipped force against Germany, but was outmaneuvered and destroyed piecemeal. Whereas had they been able to win even one of those battles, the reinforcements which had already been diverted from the Schlieffen Plan in the west, and the push that kind of allowed the First Battle of the Marne to be successful in France's favor, those troops would not have been significant enough to bolster the German position enough to stabilize in the east. So basically, Russia would have had a clean shot to Berlin, more or less, absent some kind of additional forces that would have been raised up.
What's really fascinating about this line of argumentation is that it effectively assumes that France was, if again Russia is really, you would say, the catalyst behind World War One, then they were as much the dupes of the French as anyone else, because it did not suit Russia to mobilize again so quickly and invade East Prussia prematurely, as we see with the invasion, and as we see with Tannenberg, and as we see ultimately with the battles of the Masurian Lakes. And the figures who have most culpability in terms of that disaster, image on the bottom, Yuri Danilov, the quartermaster, Zelinsky in particular, and a figure who I haven't up here, but the main commander of the Masurian fields, which is Masurian Lakes, which is Rennenkampf. All of these figures, you can say, were pursuing French objectives, which was to redirect forces such as the armies of Ludendorff and Hindenburg to, again, relieve pressure from what would later be the Victorious or the Miracle of the Marne. But it basically came at the cost of Russia and Congress Poland. And it was, say, for example, something that the Russians didn't need. It was an unforced error from their point of view. It seemed to be that France was basically directing Russian maneuvers at the expense of the Russians. So, as with the Tsar and the home front, it's, as far as I'm concerned, more an exhibition of Russian overall strategic incompetence, because the Russian army was able to prove it could be very successful on various fronts in the war. It was incredibly successful, almost unexpectedly successful in the Caucasian front with Sarikamish, and later in the war where it basically defeated the Turks in the Caucasus. And in the Galician front, where the Russians had been able to take over Przemysl in 1915 and basically secure parts of East Galicia for a large section of the war up until the end, and also prevent the Austrians from taking over all of Romania by annexing Moldova in 1916, 1917. But alas, they couldn't effectively fight against the German army, which resulted in them making major territorial concessions and withdrawals throughout the period of 1915, 1916, which was the greatest crisis for the Tsar's legitimacy going forward.
Yes, also in terms of culpability, also Samsonov. But yeah, I think it was Samsonov who was the other commander at Iberian Lakes. But yeah, I was also going to add the additional curious component that the tactical doctrines that had been developed and well, not been exhibited massively successfully in the Russo-Japanese War earlier. Those were somewhat, well, they were half practiced and half abandoned. I mean, if you get into the really nitty-gritty details, then that's one of the problems that they had, is that so many of their machine guns, for example, were used overly defensively when they had so many more, and they could have used them to much greater effect than they ultimately did. So they ended up just being retreated when the bulk of the army had already been sort of defeated. So much of their material advantage ended up coming to nothing. But yeah, it kind of, on the other hand, there's a sympathetic angle in that with such an overwhelming numerical superiority, especially at first, it almost seems ridiculous to not just walk into Prussia basically unopposed, even if they had no long-term ambitions there, as they did elsewhere. And from the perspective of trying to divert troops away from the West, that did also succeed, and it did simultaneously draw the troops away that would have made the difference in the West, and at a pace where it would not have made any difference in the East. So it put a load of troops in limbo when they could have badly been required on either front. But obviously none of that really helps if you end up losing the battle anyway.
So the last question I really want to put for this conversation, now we've arrived at World War I, is again going back to the culpability of the Tsar. I've already referenced the Willy Nicky telegrams that were sent in the final few days of the conflict, and some historians again put greater emphasis on them than others. Most actually tend to ignore them. And the reason, figures like Clark and McMeekin, for example, don't tend to really place that much emphasis on them as almost structural. The idea that foreign policy had more or less been completely sort of removed from the remit of the Tsar by this point. Sure, McMeekin emphasizes that point far more than Clark does, and I'm more in terms of following in Clark's line of logic here. Partly because I look at this and I see this as, very cynically, I see this as obfuscation. I see this essentially as buying more time for the Russian army to mobilize against the Germans than I do see it as a serious attempt at peace. And the reason I say that is that it's completely consistent with the policy that the Tsar used with the Japanese. And the result was exactly the same with the Japanese, which was the Japanese deciding to take a preemptive strike against the Russians and delivering a series of decisive victories, it should be mentioned, to the expense of the Russians. So my interpretation from the Willy Nicky correspondence is that it doesn't basically show that, oh no, the Russians were willing to make concessions and peace, and it was a desperate gambit towards the end, and the Germans deliberately censored them in order, again, to not present themselves in such a negative light, but rather that this was a very consistent policy of Tsar Nicholas running through the Russo-Japanese conflict, of which we basically examined. He was so culpable towards the end. The fact that even the prime minister at that point was one McMeekin, and the fact that I don't have him up on this this sort of list of Russian notables is significant, because he was seen as nothing more than a puppet. Yeah, Stolypin, of course, had been assassinated. We can get into conspiracy theories as to who was ultimately responsible for that. Krukovotsov had been undermined and removed just a few months before. And so we have figures like Sazonov, and we have the military clique, who are essentially all committed and contriving a situation with war. Even people who had, again, been out of power for a long time at this point, like Izvolsky, were jumping up and down, exhilarated, saying, this is my war, I am responsible for it, being a positive development in terms of that. Your point mentioning right at the beginning that all of these figures have some form of culpability in terms of ending the period of great peace. Europe was never so peaceful and prosperous, yet all of its leaders seemed so determined in terms of ending it. At the same time, that horrible tragedy to consider. But as far as my final argumentation goes, I almost think it's impossible to look at Nicholas as the passion bearer or the witness in this situation and look at him as an innocent party. I see far too much consistency in terms of his own role of basically managing his officials and in terms of his own expansionism. And I believed by the time we get to full mobilization, the German declaration of war, especially Britain's entry into the war, Russia had basically acquired everything she could possibly want in terms of fomenting a conflict. And the only question essentially was that of Russian incompetence.
The only thing that gives me pause in that line of thinking, because otherwise I think I've been relatively consistent in saying that, yeah, and basically agreeing on most of those points about Nicholas himself and his role in governance. The only thing that gives me pause is wasn't one of the main stipulations for ending the partial mobilization or the pre-mobilization steps, or let's just say partial mobilization, yeah. Wasn't one of the stipulations that there be no annexations of Serbian lands, which, as it goes, is fairly reasonable and was something that the Austrians would have been able to accede to, because that was one of the terms that was put to them for the declaration of war in the first place. But the Germans couldn't communicate that to the Russians, as I understand it.
Well, again, that was Austrian policy. The Austrians didn't want to annex any lands in Serbia. They wanted regime change. And as we see later on during the war, partitions were directed towards Bulgaria. Another argument, which is actually made, is in one of the other telegrams, which I'll reference here, which was the desire to place the Serbian issue towards The Hague. And this again brings up another caveat that we can have for Nicholas, which is that Nicholas had been one of the great advocates of the Hague Conference in terms of stipulations for the rights of officers and prisoners of war. And this would again be one of those other elements where you can say that the Tsar was earnestly wanting to place this issue before international arbitration. Again, the reason I'm so skeptical about that is that if the Russians were so interested in placing the issue before international arbitration, then why do they deliberately conceal their partial mobilization from the British? That again is always the point I come back towards. Edward Grey was pursuing that policy from the outset of the conflict and the real intensification of the July crisis in the final weeks of the month. And yet the Russians basically duped the British into believing that they had only committed to mobilization right before the German declaration of war. So in terms of, again, consistency, I just see this more as prevarication, and the Tsar essentially, again, doing what he was consistently, again, renowned for doing, which is just playing for time. And in this case, he wasn't just duping the Germans, he was duping the British.
Well, one obvious argument as to why he didn't inform the British was because he didn't trust them, which, judging by some later events, he would be quite right to not trust the British. But also, I mean, there is another angle, another fairly obvious angle, that getting earlier stages of, or proceeding with early stages of mobilization whilst making comparably reasonable demands could also potentially be interpreted as essentially laying out the carrot and the stick, as it were. So the putting the threat on one side with the intention of trying to induce a set of comparably minor concessions, and reducing the whole reducing the level of the conflict somewhat, but trying to present a situation where the threat is very much there. Obviously, the fail-state state of that is catastrophic, and what we saw play out. But
well, the final argument in your favor is all, the great emphasis has not been towards Nicholas II. The attitude towards Nicholas II seems to be one that he's overwhelmed by events, or he is just completely incompetent in this issue. My line of argumentation is just pointing at a consistent through line between the causes of the Russo-Japanese War and the causes of World War One, which I'm satisfied by. But in the case of the mobilization order, most of the cause and the blame is attached, by figures like Nibody to Sazonov, which I think is incontrovertible. Even if the Tsar, say, for example, had genuinely believed in the deterrent effect of partial mobilization, Sazonov was basically the one responsible for full mobilization and basically guaranteeing that war would be declared by Germany. So in that case, it could be a simple situation that for all the Tsar's attempts at frustrating the overbearing authority of his civilians, that in terms of him undermining a united civilian government and appealing to various ministers and pitting them against one another, that one of these figures, like we see with Izvolsky, basically going rogue. And in fairness, going back to the figure of Ignatieff, with him also going rogue, that Sazonov basically had also gone rogue at this point, and World War One was as much his creation as anything else.
Yes, definitely possible. But I've also just thought of another example of the same kind of phenomenon, which was Disraeli parking the at least a large section of the Royal Navy in the mooring it right outside Constantinople to essentially enforce a conference as opposed to sorting out things via arms. Maybe there was an intention to do a similar style of diplomacy, but obviously in both the cases that we've talked about with the outbreak of World War One and the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, you get the fail state instead, which admittedly was also in many ways stacked in Russia's favor, which was then just fumbled after the fact.
Yes, I think the irony, of course, we're pointing that out, is that the failed state, I don't think anyone could have reasonably anticipated. The expectation, of course, was that the economic, the demographic, the colonial advantage was so decisively in the favor of the Entente powers that the situation of the Russian Revolution would be completely inconceivable. So we are mentioning this with the benefit of hindsight, but if anything, again, the possibility of this grand expansion of Russia, I believe, as far as I'm concerned, actually dooms the Russian cause further. The more I read into this topic, I don't have any investment in one side or the other. Obviously, I am English. I have a huge sympathy for Russian and Austrian and German and French history, and so I feel in this situation that I'm being completely objective in terms of coming around the causes of this basically being a Franco-Russian war first and foremost, and that had Germany again seriously pursued a preemptive grand strategy towards world conquest. It did so at the worst possible time, and everything comes across as desperate, and Moltke does not come, and Bettman Holvig do not come across as a great sort of masterful statesman, because all you need to do is compare them to the example of Bismarck. Bismarck, who was clearly in control of diplomatic events and was able to correctly judge the diplomatic situation in Europe. If anything, again, we're presenting a paradox where the Russians were diplomatically and the French were being diplomatically competent, the Germans diplomatically incompetent, but the Russians were being militarily and administratively incompetent compared to the Germans by comparison. So I think I will leave the conversation there for today, but it's certainly been interesting, and it's been wonderful to go back and forth and pick your brain on this.
Well, I think also just one other point is there is the earlier I did want to bring up the domestic component of what you're saying about trying to appear on the defensive and have the other side essentially declare on you rather than you having to appear the aggressor. But that is, to circle all the way back, that is one of the reasons why it was basically universally approved of, the outbreak of the war, is because I guess you could say possibly because the baseline of diplomats was so high that basically everybody believed themselves to be on the defensive. They all believed that the opposition were the aggressor, and that their country could not have reasonably done anything different if much of the population themselves were in charge. There was a famous anecdote. I wish I could remember his name now. He was a very famous French pacifist who was expected to denounce the war, and so he was himself brought in to the and given access to the the records of correspondence and whatever during the July crisis, and he was right about to publish an article or an editorial, basically saying that he supports the war because he could not find a single point at which he would have, as a pacifist, done differently to the French government in their conduct. And then he was shot.
Very famously, the French Prime Minister at the time, Viviani, Poincaré, for a reference, was the president and the foreign minister, but Viviani was a sort of a moderate socialist and a pacifist, and he was completely brought over to the cause of war. And of course, we have to mention the Union Sacrée in the case of France, which was all the disparate elements of the left and the right, and even the Catholic monarchist right rallying towards the Republic in terms of the defense of the cause. So yes, the sort of fantastical component of the war and the tragic element further compounding it is that every side could legitimately present themselves as the injured party, the defensive party in this war, which of course in terms of Russia is how Tsar Nicholas was able to cast himself in the guise of more comparisons to Alexander I and present this as a second patriotic war, and Germany as Napoleon. But anyway, I really should get to the super chats, but it's all very interesting. Gotskolk, I'm not sure what currency that is, but thank you. We'll probably have to sleep before the end of the stream, so I dare not ask any questions in case you address, if any, in the past 10 minutes. Very good topic, and I can't wait to finish tomorrow. Well, thank you very much, Godskolk. Utavari 1. Apis, who funded Princip, said he was propped up by Russia. Yes, and the Russian ambassador to Belgrade, I believe, was very conveniently outside of Serbia when the assassination attempt went by. And of course, people have speculated since that he had done so in order to establish a Russian alibi. Indeed, there's some really disturbing elements about the whole reaction, is that after the assassination attempt, diplomatic flags were flown at half-mast, obviously. But in the case, say, for example, of the Italian embassy in Rome, the Russians did not. And when they were pressed on the issue, I forget which diplomatic official was questioned on this. It was more a case of Russia basically saying that, well, we know more instances of terrorism and assassination to the point that we deserve the sympathy in this situation. Which you have to sort of admire the chutzpah, but if anything, it underlines a completely established Russian hostility towards Austria. And if anything, again, it just sort of buttresses the idea that they, if not directly implicated, they were at least tacitly aware, if not necessarily condoning the plan. And as has to be mentioned, the Black Hand are intimately connected to Russia, and they were the engine behind the dramatic reversal of alliances from 1903 to 1908. And if nothing else, the Bosnian crisis of 1908-1909 helped basically create a national mythology around the Russian alliance, which was lacking. So it may not have been Izvolsky's intention, but it was very much the effect. Utavari 1 for €2. Thank you very much. Croat clergy hated the West, came up with Pan-Slavism. Well, there are many different origin points of Pan-Slavism. Part of the reason why, I mean, this all goes back actually to the late 16th century and the 17th century. One cause for Pan-Slavism was basically opposition towards Austrian and Ottoman domination and a desire for autonomy, which was actually based around the old medieval kingdom of Croatia. Another great indicator for burgeoning Pan-Slavism was the quote-unquote Slavic conference during the revolutions of 1848 in Prague. So, as has been demonstrated abundantly throughout this conversation in terms of the Tsar appropriating all nationalistic and expansionist impulses to himself and opening the question of his culpability in terms of the tragedy that we're seeing in hindsight, it wasn't just that Pan-Slavism was a movement beyond the Tsar, but even within the narrow confines of Russia, it was something that was repressed as much as it was parroted in some elements of Tsarist foreign policy. Bill Josh 3819 for $40. That's very generous. Thank you very much. I don't catch you live often, so here's a super chat while I have time. I'm reading Sleepwalkers by Christopher Clark. I get the impression that some sort of mass conflict was inevitable in Europe at this time. Do you agree? I don't believe it was inevitable, but I'm increasingly of the view that European leaders and European elites all across Europe were willing to get involved in a conflict over increasingly nebulous causes. The Serbian debacle was just a casus belli. There was, as far as I'm concerned, there was nothing in the way of existential crisis for Russia that was presented in Serbia. Rather, what the Russian response to the Serbian situation did was present an existential crisis for Austria-Hungary and Germany. And as I've already mentioned, through the various sort of diplomatic debacles in the run-up to the war, Danilov in particular has this infamous quote, the quartermaster, whereby the best road to Constantinople was through Berlin and Vienna. In other words, the partition of the Ottoman Empire was dependent on the dispossession and destruction of all three of Russia's main continental adversaries. And you have other anecdotes of, I can't remember the exact Russian Grand Duchess who said this during the height of the July crisis, but the Russian armies and the French armies will meet each other in Berlin. So yes, there was very much a conscious association that war was coming, and that it was simply a matter of configuring the right alliances in order to ensure a favorable outcome. And as Rupert and I have been at pains to say, that alliance system very clearly favored the Russians. And had the Russians been more effective during the war, it's very possible that Tsar Nicholas could have been one of the greatest conquerors in world history, which, if we're looking at so much of his image being post hoc, would eliminate the whole passion bearer, witness of Christ, martyrdom cause we have going with Nicholas II. History could have turned out very differently for him.
I know even that there are some cases that are made about him that if he'd made it as far as the second half of 1917, then he basically would have been through the worst of it. But yeah, that gets far more into the weeds. One thing I do wonder about, though, to push back a little bit on the idea that the conflict was inevitable. So, I've mentioned a few times that basically everyone wanted it, but my sense is that actually the people in the decision-making positions tended to want it slightly less than the general population. So there was kind of like a romantic yearning to break apart the old order in one way or another, either in search of adventure for its own sake or because they had some fundamental grievance with it, like socialists wanting to tear down all of the ancien regimes and such.
Well, you say that, but the fascinating thing I found about reading more about this period is that I find myself sympathizing far more with the socialists than I do with many conservatives, which may sound completely remarkable to people listening to this, but from the more sort of doctrinaire socialists in Germany, as opposed to the national coalition that was built up, to the Labour Party in England, to the socialists and the unionists within France, consistently they were concerned more with the stability of European civilization over class conflict for its own sake. Even when you have figures like Lenin was critiquing the conflict as an inevitable outcome of capitalist imperialism. He was not supporting the war on any one side. So it's very complicated if you look at this. I mean, my own research regarding Britain's own entry into the war is that I basically see this more as a right-wing conservative-led movement more than anything else, whereas the left and a large section of the Liberal Party was dogmatically opposed to the war. And so it required people who were basically not really on the Liberal Party, but on the sort of bipartisan or the right, like Edward Grey and like Winston Churchill, to basically dupe the British public into supporting a Liberal government-led coalition into the war through the Belgian situation, which provided the perfect casus belli. So, and it's the same in France. Again, it tended to be the more Boulanger-esque populist right-wingers who were supportive of the war. And in Germany, again, it's the same thing with the more militaristic sort of Prussian elements who, again, are pro-war. In the case of Austria, it's even more complicated because you have the war party, which is basically split down various national lines. The most consistently anti-war faction within Austria were the Hungarian aristocracy. And the reason that is the case is very specific and almost unique to Austria-Hungary, in the situation where they believe that any aggrandizement or annexations to Austria would weaken the position of the Hungarian aristocracy within the composite empire. So it's an incredibly complicated situation, and I always try and revolt against this idea that war was inevitable. But I'm also increasingly depressed and horrified by a remarkable degree of flippancy that I see in the correspondence and the celebration of the outcome of the conflict in 1914.
I mean, well, it's somewhat okay. Yeah, we know how awful it is, but to somewhat devil's advocate, I suppose, considering the old aristocracy's position is essentially built off that primacy in war position. An extended peace is somewhat more dangerous to them, whereas obviously for the socialists they get a lot of. So okay, for one thing, there was less of a hard what we would identify as left-right divide in the socialist movements. So there were more nationally minded, significantly more nationally minded people in the various socialist movements, and they were very comfortable there, and there wasn't seen as much of being much of a contradiction there before communism had kind of showed up in as a practiced, or as a system actually in practice. But yeah, also just the factor of the old military aristocracy and the aristocracy that had built itself on service in wartime, not being something that had been completely destroyed yet by both world wars, meant that, for one thing, their position somewhat rested on that, and in the case of someone like Germany, the position of the aristocracy was greatly enhanced by the emergence of the war. And had the war gone in their favor, then, well, even with the war not going in their favor, people like Ludendorff and Hindenburg did become national icons who could really throw their weight around in national politics, and their position in general was greatly strengthened. But also all of the plans and all the assumptions were built around the idea of a very quick war, and a lot of, as I spoke about, only in regards to Russia, there's a fairly significant preponderance of factors that led towards it being a very short war, as a fairly crushing victory for one side or the other, and it's a series of some unlikely, some likely factors that led it to be pretty much right about stalemate for the crucial opening phases, and then drew out into a much longer, more bloody and horrendous affair. And then that leads to what we kind of started this with, which is that it ends, and then nobody finds the outcome satisfying, barring a few extreme outliers, because the cost paid was massive, and the actual changes at the end of it and the rewards for any single power are pretty minimal.
I think, just to sort of conclude these remarks, I always have to relay this back to the Napoleonic Wars, in that all of these things, the eruption of national consciousness, the class upheaval, the threats against an established socially sort of conditioned order, they had been demonstrated abundantly during the French Revolution. And the whole Metternician system had been basically a case of wanting to place the genie back in the bottle. In the case of Bismarck and even Cavour, they had basically presented themselves, and even Napoleon III, they had presented themselves as subversive at one point, but would inevitably go back to a far more hardline, conservative posture in various aspects of their foreign policy. The fact that, again, Bismarck would completely and utterly reform Central European sort of identity and politics in order to place Prussia in a position of primacy, only then to reconfigure the Metternician system, is a testament to that, really. If anything, I think this is a tragic element of the aristocracy, like the Tsar, leaning too much into the impulses of what we see with the French Revolution, which is demagoguery, populism, national, a sort of moment of national belonging or national becoming or whatever, and believing that they can direct those forces successfully into a definitive outcome. This is not something which is unique to either Russia or Germany. I believe both sides were thinking along these times. Russia, from their point of view, believed, oh well, Austria-Hungary, its demise is inevitable. So what better way to achieve it than basically doing so with triumph, with us leading the Pan-Slavic cause. In the same way, we have remarks like from Beppmann Holvig saying that this will crush, democratic socialism forever, and the German sort of identity and the national movement will be forever, welded to the cause of the Junkers and the right. So you can look into many causes of this, but you're never going to find a satisfactory or sort of just answer to any of these conflicts.
Yeah, I mean that shows up in the propaganda as well, and that basically every side wanted to portray themselves as the upholders of conservative tradition and all good and stable things, and the opposition as hotbeds of anarchism and socialism and
which itself is so subversive, because, like I said, this is born out of the idea of the concert of Europe and the princes remaining essentially above the interests of demagoguery and propaganda in order to appeal to each other, which is why Nicholas II is such a fascinating figure, because he once exemplifies this and also subverts it entirely, which is why his role in this has been fascinating to talk about. But I really ought to continue on.
Sorry, can I make one more very quick point? Sorry about the
yeah, sure.
Inevitability of European war. Is just one other quick point is that I tend to also see, though, that a lot of the major flashpoints, because obviously there does need to be a proper casus belli as well, and that most of the places where that could have actually happened were being closed up over time. So that is sort of what leans me towards the idea that it was kind of a stormy period that could have been passed through. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the issue essentially is with the whole nature of the partition of the Ottoman Empire. The partition of the Ottoman Empire had demonstrated that there was a situation in which Austria-Hungary and Russia themselves could be dismantled as the followers of Turkey in terms of being the sick men of Europe. And so, if anything, that it actually reveals a course that Metternich was actually correct. It may have been one of the most controversial aspects of the Congress of Vienna, which was to prop up the Ottoman Empire, even though it's a Muslim empire in Europe, because the alternative was to basically demonstrate the vulnerability of all the other great powers of the right. And so the fact that it was the Ottoman Empire that was declining rapidly and the situation in the Balkans was so dramatic, it basically became in many ways incumbent upon Russia and Austria-Hungary to correct the situation decisively to their benefit. And I tend to focus again on the Balkan causes and the Ottoman causes, the First World War. But many at the time and since have basically looked at the Ottoman Empire as presaging what would happen to the Austrians and the Russians. I don't think anyone would have really thought of Austria as a moribund entity had the Ottoman Empire itself not looked so weak at that time.
Yeah, that's fair.
So Alfred's again for £5. If Russia hadn't mobilized, the war could have been contained to the Balkans, and what would have happened to the Trianon stream? Yes, if the Russians hadn't mobilized, then Serbia would have been subject to regime change, and there would have been a popular pushback against the Tsar. The Tsar would have been seen to be very weak. He would have suffered a loss of prestige. But if anything, I think actually it was a great sort of strategic withdrawal for Russia, because Serbia, being basically a terrorist, not led state, but a terrorist influenced state, was a bit of a loose cannon in the Balkans. And so basically having all of the Balkans under Austrian and German influence, I think, to buttress Rupert's argument, actually, would have been a great cause for Balkan stability, to basically concede that whole region and to basically confront Russia with the situation: no, expansionism isn't possible. You are being cut off from all potential spheres of influence. You now need to focus on internal order and development. Obviously, that would have been very frustrating to the Tsar, who I've consistently portrayed as having very expansionist and idealistic aims. But I think that would have been by far the best outcome for Europe and the world going forward. As for the Trianon stream, that's something I've always been wanting to do regarding Hungary, but I've been putting it off indefinitely. And to be perfectly honest, it's only because other subjects tend to take preeminence. I will get to it eventually, even though I may never. It seems like I'm never getting to it, but I will get to it eventually.
By extension, though, quickly, just if Germany hadn't been hadn't given the blank check, then that would have also contained the war. So if it had just been Russia and Austria-Hungary mobilizing, I believe that wouldn't have invoked the various alliances. Obviously, Austria could not have won that war, though, so they probably would have had to back down. But yeah, that would be another way of averting the wider cataclysm.
I don't think there's any situation in which Austria and Russia could have localized that conflict, because in any such conflict, the Austrians would inevitably lose, and then all of Germany's basically strategic outcomes and gains, its alliance with Turkey, would also be in tatters, as well as alliance with Bulgaria and potential alliance with Romania and Greece. So I still see that correctly the Germans would have deduced any partial mobilization directed against Austria as an existential crisis, which they did, and which the Russians probably recognized, which is why they did it.
Yeah, like I said, in that scenario, Austria would be forced to back down and could, well, by refusing to countenance that option, Germany elevates it from a regional two-power war into, invoking all the alliances.
Well, let me just put it this way. It was far more imperative for Austria to deal with the Serb problem than it was imperative for Russia to support the Serbs. From the point of view of all Austrian strategic planning, Serbia was the Trojan horse that would be used to carve up all the Slavic elements within the empire, and appealing to Russia was just the final element to make the Austrian general staff completely and utterly paranoid. So that in itself was a major flashpoint and node of instability within Europe, and the Russians were, like I said, were more than willing to exploit that. Easterly Westerner for $20. Thank you very much. It's easy to pin the blame on one player or another for the lead up of World War One. From each player's outlook, though, he himself on the right, Remax cited paper brings up Hegel's tragedy comes from right against right. Well, part of my emphasis on this stream actually is to try and put it in a broader sort of comparative context. I've again always been fascinated with the figure of Nicholas II, and my sort of coming to my various conclusions about the war is completely there is no sort of agenda. I'm simply trying to present. It's simply, it is the way it is. And what is interesting, though, is that there is clearly, in terms of following the lines of a tradition of aggression or whatever, the reason we're talking about this stream and the reason why the academic discourse actually tends to be following in this line of logic, I think will also follow a more insidious line of reasoning, which is affecting current events in Ukraine today and trying to present Russia as a perennial issue in this region in a way that we basically collectively decided to ignore that for a brief period of time when it came to the First World War. But thank you very much for your super chat. Zach, fake name, for $5. Thank you. Good evening, AM. Good evening, Rupert. It's always a joy to catch you live. I'll watch the entire stream when I get more time. Well, thank you very much, Zach, fake name. And Rail Leonard for $10. Thank you very much. Good evening. I watched the majority of your videos, but this is the first time catching you live. Thank you for all your knowledge I've gained through subscribing to your channel. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you very much again, Rail Leonard, and everyone who has sent a super chat this evening. Rupert, is there anything you'd like to say before we leave?
Nothing additional, I don't think. I've pretty much said everything. Pretty much probably being more of the apologist here. But yeah, it's definitely been a very good explanation. Thanks for having me on again.
Yes, I think I have a far lower tolerance for perceived incompetence. Not just in terms of in any figure, Really, I tend to revel in terms of analyzing failure, and this stream is basically just another one of those instances, as far as I'm concerned.
I believe we've had this conversation briefly before about Charles I, in that when I'm sort of going through each stage, looking at the decisions put in front of them and what they knew at the time, trying to not be coloured by knowledge of what comes afterwards and how it all ends up. It's often hard to find specific places where the wrong decision was made, I find, with these figures. One thing I did think about as we were going through, especially so we were referencing briefly Puppet and Ostev earlier, and framing Nicholas II as a fairly weak-willed figure. I read that as basically being similar to Alexander III's position, in that he was broadly not necessarily following the dictates of Puppet and Ostev, but not hugely strong-willed in a lot of areas, and not particularly forthright in a particular ideal policy destination. But because it doesn't end in cataclysm, and because he had certain other personal qualities that made him sort of naturally more imposing, he gets a lot more credit than Nicholas does. So I don't know. Maybe I'm too much of a Imperial Russophile in these cases to see clearly. But
well, Povedanotsev was the Oberprocurator of the Holy Synod, and he was partially a tutor to Nicholas II. So as an ideologue, he had a lot of influence on Alexander in terms of publishing the Manifesto of Unshakable Autocracy, and in basically eliminating the more Francophile elements of Alexander II's regime, and in eliminating all attempts at parliamentarianism. Povedanotsev was very useful to Alexander III, and I believe Povedanotsev's influence was paramount over Nicholas II, clearly, because Nicholas II, even though he was content, again, mainly under Witter's influence, to concede the Constitution of 1906, the quote-unquote fundamental law of the Russian Empire, he did everything in his power in terms of being able to circumvent it. Only a figure, interestingly enough, like Stolypin, was moderately successful in terms of managing the Duma, managing the Tsar, and by extension, managing Russia as a whole. And in this case, Stolypin is the great exception to all of this. So again, perhaps had Stolypin lived longer and perhaps had more of an influence over this, event, history could have played out differently. But that's a conversation for another time.
Well, it's also interesting that Puppet and Ostev essentially personally ended the Zubatovka police socialism movement as well, and Zubatov's successor, can't remember his name off the top of my head, but yeah, they basically just had two different visions for what combating these movements would look like, and yeah, sort of just stepped on each other's toes. And I don't think it's necessarily fair to call one more loyalist than the other, or less loyalist. They just had competing visions.
St. Martin for $15 Australian dollars. Thank you very much. Thank you, AM, and guest Rupert. Well, thank you very much, St. Martin. Udvari 1 for $5 for €5 again. Thank you. All Pan-Slavism traces to a dozen guys from 16th century Croatia and immediate translations of Pribojevic and Orbim. Their ideas caught on widely but shallowly. Well, clearly not all Pan-Slavism, because we've been talking about all the origins of Pan-Slavism from all the other Pan-Slavic countries. So, and obviously the Horodnas and the democratic fetishism of the Mirs, agrarian Russia, and the Cossacks is clearly something that wasn't in evidence in Croatia. So that's, I don't understand your point there, but and I've already conceded the 16th century origins in Croatia in part, so alongside the Renaissance. So there we are, but thank you for your super chat. All right, good night, everyone.